Chapter X. The Red International of Labor Unions. The loss of the IGIG steel strike upset my whole strategy. Gone was the plan for using this struggle as a springboard for beginning a general organizing campaign in all industries, and gone also was my hope of overthrowing the Gompers machine by the mass organization of the unorganized. But from our experience in the meatpacking and steel campaigns, two important lessons, aside from the major lessons of the great need for industrial unionism, etc., stood out sharp and clear for us as militants, and we proceeded to act upon them. The first was that our policy of boring from within was fundamentally correct. A mere handful of us syndicalists had been instrumental in launching and leading movements that had organized over 500,000 workers, native and foreign-born, Negroes and whites, skilled and unskilled, women and youth, in two of the most highly trustified industries in the United States. Furthermore, we had succeeded in directing these movements into elementary industrial channels, and the whole job had been done in the face of the crassest incompetency, indifference and downright sabotage of the A.F. of L leadership. The second special lesson re-emphasized for us in meatpacking and steel was that in order to bore from within we had to have a left-wing group, an organized militant minority. The loose united front we had made with the progressive elements was not enough. In both campaigns the lack of a strong left-wing organization had been a disastrous handicap to us, with the official union machinery as it was, in the hands of the reactionary top union leadership. In the packing industry we had suffered severely for want of an organized left-wing movement behind us. In the steel campaign, with a crew of about 150 organizers under our leadership, about half of whom were socialists, progressives and farmer laborites and other union militants, and including such old S.L. of N.A. fighters as Joe Manley and Sam Hammersmark, we were not so badly off as in meatpacking. It was TLI's instrument of rank and file control that had enabled us to defy the deadly demand of Wilson and Gompers that the steel strike be postponed, that is, liquidated. But this organization also was insufficient. Clearly, we had to build another boring from within organization. The old S.L. of N.A. and I.T.U.E.L. had gone on the rocks, it is true, but maybe we would have better success next time. With this general idea in mind, therefore, I resigned my position as B.R.C.A. organizer and secretary of the moribund National Steel Committee in January 1920, when the strike was finished. I was determined to go back to work on the railroad and to try again, as a rank and filer, to build an organized left-wing movement in the trade unions. After spending a few months writing my steel strike book, I tried for a railroad job, but I found that I was blacklisted at my trade in Chicago. I worked a short while on the C.F. of L official paper, but gave this up and then found myself unemployed. In the meantime Jack Johnston, Joe Manley, myself and some other Chicago militants had been preparing the way for our new left-wing trade union organization. Finally, in November 1920, we launched it, a Chicago group of a couple of dozen members, and we called it the Trade Union Educational League. Again I was elected secretary. The old disease, dual unionism. Immediately, the newly organized T.U.E.L. bumped against the same rock upon which its two predecessors, the S.L. of N.A. and the I.T.U.E.L. had been wrecked, the dual union attitude held generally by revolutionary elements. This seemed as strong as ever. During the packing house and steel campaigns the dual union illusion had been a great handicap to us. We simply could not induce the left-wing militants, of whom there were large numbers among the great masses of Polish, Russian, Lithuanian and other migrant workers, to participate aggressively in the two big organization campaigns. In the packing industry Jack Johnston had spoken before left S.P. groups and fairly begged them to help him fight the lane reactionary leadership. But in vain, the A.F. of L was simply poison to them and they would have none of it. In the steel campaign the situation was about the same. The dualistic S.P. left wing, out of which the Communist Party was then being born, assumed, except in one or two places, an indifferent and very unsympathetic attitude to our movement, while the I.W.W. and the S.L.P. denounced it in the sharpest terms. An example of the strength of dual union sentiment at the time was the clash we had with Eugene V. Debs in Youngstown, in 1919, in this great steel center, where the A.F. of L had been badly discredited recently by betrayed strikes. We were having a desperately hard time to get the workers organized. Debs, then just on the eve of going to jail for his Canton anti-war speech, was holding big meetings there and sharply assailing our movement with typical dualist arguments. This increased our difficulties and incensed our organizers, and I was made one of a committee of 3 to visit Debs to demand that he cease his attacks on pain of our making an open fight against him. Finally, he agreed to do this, but we could not induce him to tell the masses of steel workers who packed his meetings to join the A.F. of L unions. Later on, however, when the big strike took place, Debs heartily endorsed it and sent me word from Atlanta Penitentiary that if he were free he would be fighting shoulder to shoulder with us to win the strike. By 1920, the I.W., the traditional hope of dual unionists, had heavily declined after its wartime spurt and had degenerated pretty much into a defense organization for its many political prisoners. But the dual union sentiment, nevertheless, fed upon a number of other independent industrial unions, all either very weak and some altogether fruitless, including the Amalgamated Food Workers, United Labor Council, etc. The main one of such unions was the One Big Union of Canada, which exerted considerable influence in the United States. After the turn of the century, Canadian rebels had not been so badly afflicted by dualism as the American left wing, and over a period of years they had won control of the whole union in the West and were rapidly securing leadership over the entire Canadian trade union movement. But the dual union illusion finally caught up with them and their promising situation was wrecked by the launching of the ill-fated One Big Union in Calgary. March 13, 1919, the O.B.U., by pulling the militants out of the old unions, as usual, left the reactionaries in complete control. Despite its long-continued lack of success, the dual union theory, however, still continued to exert a hypnotic effect over almost the whole American left wing. The I.W., fanatically dualist, would not even discuss the question of working within the trade unions, nor would the S.L.P., nor what remained of a left wing in the S.P., after the 1919 split. The nascent communist movement, just bomb out of the S.P., in the shape of two communist parties, was similarly dualist and endorsed the I.W. Even liberals and progressives, in the trade unions and outside, were also dead sure that nothing could be done in the old trade unions. I remember how, at a meeting of such liberal elements in New York in 1920, after my speech on the steel campaign, they scoffed at my proposals that revolutionists should give up their foolish policy of building dual unions and should concentrate upon work within the conservative trade unions. Unexpected reinforcements. In view of this almost unanimous left-wing hostility to boring from within, the frail, newly born T.U.E.L. faced a most unpromising struggle for existence. It seemed fated soon to join its luckless predecessors. But it suddenly received very powerful assistance from an unlooked-for quarter, which changed radically the whole situation. This much-needed help came from none less than the great leader of the Russian Revolution, Lenin. It so occurred that in the early days of the T.U.E.L., I had happened upon Lenin's famous pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder. Here, to my great joy and amazement, I found revolutionary dual unionism condemned and the boring from within policy endorsed much more clearly and forcefully than we had ever expressed it. Among other attacks on dualism, Lenin said, "The German, left, communists are guilty of just this stupid ity when, because of the reactionary and counter-revolutionary character of the heads of the trade unions, they jump to the conclusion that it is necessary to leave the trade unions, to refuse to work in them, to create new, fantastic forms of labor organizations. This is an unpardonable blunder that would equal the greatest service the communists could render the bourgeoisie. To refuse to work in the reactionary trade unions means leaving the insufficiently developed or backward working masses under the influence of reactionary leaders, agents of the bourgeoisie, labor aristocrats, or bourgeoisified workers. There can be no doubt that Messieurs the Gomperses, Hendersons, Jaouot, Legion, and the like, are very grateful to such left revolutionaries. Needless to say, the T.U.E.L. militants used Lenin's pamphlet effectively in left-wing circles. Then came further encouraging news from Moscow. At its first Congress, the Communist International, under pressure of the American delegation, and absorbed in the great task of preliminary mobilization of its forces, had given countenance to dual unionism by calling upon the I.W. to take the initiative in trying to establish a basis for the uniting in one organization of all unions which have a class-conscious character, of all workers who accept the class struggle, such as the W.I.U., the One Big Union, and certain insurgent unions in the A.F. of L. But the Second C.I. Congress, held early in 1920, was able to devote closer attention to this question and, with the American delegation opposed, declared categorically against dual unionism and for working within the conservative trade unions. We old-time boors from within were more than delighted at these sudden and far-reaching developments. It appeared that our 10-year fight for work within the conservative unions was at last going to be successful. Nor were we mistaken. Lenin's writings and the action of the Comintern for the first time produced a real discussion on the dual union question in the United States. The result was inevitable. The dual union myth was exploded. Soon the two CPs, which were not yet amalgamated, endorsed the Comintern policy, and so did, likewise, a section of the I.W. Dual unionism received a fatal blow. The revolutionary movement in the United States had come to a new turning point. The first Congress of the R.I.L.U. Just at this juncture I was invited to attend the first Congress of the Red International of Labor Unions, to be held in Moscow in the spring of 1921. Our Chicago group agreed and I went as one of the T.U.E.L. delegates. The T.U.E.L. delegation also included Earl R. Browder and Mother Bloor. In addition, there was an I.W. delegation of several, with Bill Haywood at its head. Herbert M. Wells and Dennis Batt were fraternal delegates from the Seattle and Detroit Central Labor Councils respectively. There were also a few delegates from New York independent revolutionary unions. This first R.I.L.U. Congress was an historic occasion. It launched the first revolutionary trade union international movement since the days of the old International Working Men's Association, of which Karl Marx was the political leader. Its organization came about as a result of the long years of treachery of the Amsterdam trade union Internationale and its socialist-controlled trade federations. The newly formed R.I.L.U. consisted of the Russian unions, left socialist and syndicalist unions in various countries and organized minorities within the social democratic unions in many lands. This is no place, however, to review in detail the work of the first R.I.L.U. Congress. Here I shall confine myself to those questions most directly concerning the American situation. The main issue in this respect was that of boring from within. The fight developed around a demand of the I.W., which was supported by the New York revolutionary unions, for an endorsement of dual unionism. A sharp struggle took place. But the Congress, in line with its general policy on the union question, declared basically for a policy of boring from within in the United States. Its decision said, the members of the IWW should join their respective trade unions and spread their propaganda among them, explaining the working class problems. The longer they keep themselves aloof from the American Federation of Labor, the greater will be the sufferings and the harder will be the process of advancement of the unorganized workers. The decision further pointed out, therefore, the question of creating revolutionary cells and groups inside the A.F.L. and independent unions is of vital importance. There is no other way by which we could gain the working mass in America than to lead a systematic struggle in the unions. The I.W. delegates were incensed at this rejection of their fetish of dual unionism. It is true that there was a crumb of comfort for them in the decision by its provision that where mass independent unions already existed they should not be liquidated, but the I.W. were violently angry that the new Revolutionary International had rejected their claim to being the only genuine labor movement of the United States. Syndicalists from other countries, most of whom were dual unionists, shared their dissatisfaction. Another basic question that created much heat and division was that of political action. The Congress declared categorically for political action and for fraternal collaboration with the Communist International. As for myself, I was prepared to accept such a decision because during the course of the meatpacking and steel campaigns my old syndicalist anti-politics had started to collapse. So much so that by early in 1920 I had begun to be active in the Labor Party, then centering in Chicago. But to the other syndicalists, including the I.W., and some groups and small unions from Spain, Italy, France, Germany, etc., the whole idea of political action was anathema and taboo. They fought fiercely against it. Further clashes were had with the I.W. and other syndicalists over the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. They, in substance, demanded the abolition of the Soviet state and the turning over of the industries to the trade unions. To me, in view of what I had already learned of the Russian situation, this proposal seemed sheer madness. It showed quite clearly that the syndicalists did not know the way to the revolution, nor did they recognize the revolution when it stood before their very eyes. So far did the syndicalists go in their anti-Soviet attitude in the Congress that they openly criticized the suppression of the dangerous Kronstadt revolt of a few months before. In the latter matter they accepted the leadership of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, who, running here and there all over the hall, were organizing the struggle against the communists and the Soviet government. Goldman and Berkman were at this time actively supporting the Ukrainian anarchist bandit, Makhno, who was carrying on an armed struggle against the Soviet government. They denied this when so accused by Bukharin at the R.I.L.U. Congress, but it is sufficient to note that Makhno has long since become an anarchist hero. In the San Francisco anarchist journal, Man. With such grievous differences over the basic questions of trade unionism, political action, the dictatorship of the proletariat, etc., it is not surprising that many of the syndicalists and anarchists did not join up with the newly formed R.I.L.U. In fact, anticipating a split, they had held a conference a short while before in Berlin and they decided to form an international of their own. For them the R.I.L.U. Congress was only a favorable jumping-off point to launch their own international. Their secession finally crystallized into the sectarian and short-lived so-called Berlin Syndicalist International. Upon his return to the United States, Williams of the I.W.W. delegation submitted a grossly hostile, counter-revolutionary report, and the I.W.W. leaders voted to repudiate the R.I.L.U. and all its works. In December 1921, they declared, the G.E.B. of the I.W.W. recommends that this organization does not affiliate with the R.I.L.U. This was followed up with a barrage of slanders against the R.I.L.U., the Comintern, the Communist Party and the Soviet government. The I.W.W., from that time on, has persisted in an anti-Soviet vilification, hardly to be equaled even by the attacks of the A.F. of L., the Hearst Press and the Civic Federation. The Haywood, Hardy, George Smith, Mink, etc. minority of the I.W.W., however, supported the R.I.L.U. Haywood, ill and facing a 20-year sentence for anti-war activities, remained in Moscow after the Congress and never returned to the United States. Thus one of the finest sons of the working class passed out of the American scene. Haywood was a real battler, a true proletarian fighter. He was the leader of the old Western Federation of Miners when it made its most glorious traditions of struggle. He was the outstanding figure in the I.W.W. in the days of its greatest militancy and success, when it led many great strikes and produced such. August 1934, for example, together with agitation in favor of the Hitler provocateur who burned the Reichstag building, van der Lubbe, there is an appeal for funds for Machno, then lying fatally ill in Paris. Fighters as V. Street, John, Frank Little, E. G. Flynn, etc., he led the left wing of the S.P. in its historical fight in 1912, and under his leadership the I.15W had made the best fight of any American organization against the war. Debs was the greatest agitator of the American Revolutionary movement, but Haywood was its most outstanding fighter. With unerring proletarian instinct, Haywood knew the enemies of his class and fought them without giving or asking quarter, whether they were a bunch of gunmen at the picket line, capitalist warmongers or a clique of opportunist intellectuals controlling the Socialist Party. His only serious political error was his characteristic American deviation into dual unionism and syndicalism. It was no accident that the splendid fighter, Haywood, eventually took his place in the ranks of that fighting organization, the Communist Party. He died in Moscow in 1928 and part of his ashes now lie beside the heroic revolutionary dead under the Kremlin Wall and the rest beside the Haymarket Martyrs in Chicago. The favorable action of the R.I.L.U. Congress on the question of boring from within was backed up by the R.I.L.U. endorsing the T.U.E.L. as its American section. Our delegation was elated at all this. We were sure that at last the basis had been laid for a sound revolutionary union policy in the United States, and we believed much success could be secured. And the sequel showed conclusively that we were right in our optimism. Chapter 11. The Communist International. Immediately following the first R.I.L.U. Congress in Moscow in 1921, there took place the Third Congress of the Communist International. Among the several hundred delegates present were the great Lenin and many leading revolutionary fighters from all over the world. I attended the sessions of the Congress and followed its deliberations with very eager interest. The Congress naturally took the same line as the R.I.L.U. on the questions which immediately interested me most: boring from within and syndicalism. But instead of reviewing in detail the work of the Congress, let me deal generally with the development of the Communist International and thereby the main analysis which led me to become a communist. The Communist International, or Comintern, held its first Congress in March 1919. The roots of the Comintern were started in the wartime conferences of revolutionists held in Kienthal and Zimmerwald and in the left-wing groupings that had been taking shape within the socialist parties of the world even before the war. The crystallization of the Comintern and its constituent communist parties became historically necessary because of the bankruptcy of the social reformist socialist parties of the Second International, a bankruptcy which climaxed in the support of their respective capitalist classes during the World War and their defense of capitalism against the threatening proletarian revolution. The bankruptcy of social reformism. Prior to the World War, the masses of revolutionary workers everywhere, except for syndicalist and anarchist minorities, 144 from Byran to Stalin pinned their hope on the socialist parties for the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of socialism. But it proved to be an illusory hope. Bitter experience was to demonstrate that the Socialist International, instead of being the great menace to capitalism, was its mainstay and savior. About the middle of the 19th century, Marx and Engels had founded the socialist movement upon revolutionary principles. In the Communist Manifesto, these leaders showed how the whole development of capitalism led to the greater exploitation and impoverishment of the masses, to the sharpening of class antagonisms, to the awakening of revolutionary class consciousness among the workers and other toilers, who would finally overthrow capitalism, set up the dictatorship of the proletariat and begin to build socialism as the transition stage to communism. But in the long pre-war period of relatively peaceful development and expansion of capitalism, the socialist parties everywhere fell into the hands of petty bourgeois intellectuals and conservative trade union officials. These opportunistic leaders gradually rejected and repudiated the revolutionary Marxian perspective. Instead, they developed revisionist reformist theories of constantly improving living standards and increasing civil liberties of the masses under capitalism, and of the painless growth of capitalism into socialism by a gradual process of nationalizing the industries through purchase and by the winning of control of the government through building up socialist majorities in the parliaments. Two conclusions of profound importance flowed from these reformist theories. The first was a total disbelief not only in the necessity, but also the possibility of the proletarian revolution. The reformist socialist leaders never tired of asserting that revolution would mean chaos, that the inexperienced workers could never take hold of and operate the complicated economic, political and social structure, that the workers had to get this control piece by piece, in the course of long years, learning as they went how to direct society. The second general conclusion, required by the first, was that Communist International 145 in order to develop capitalism into socialism, it was fundamentally necessary to maintain the capitalist system intact by defending it from both the revolutionary attacks by the workers and from the workings of capitalism's own internal forces that tend to break it down and disrupt it. The result of the whole reformist conception, therefore, was to completely identify the interest of the socialist parties with the capitalists of the various countries. Hence they helped the employers fight against the developing proletarian revolution and aided them in carrying through drastic measures to expand imperialistically the respective national capitalist systems and to keep them from collapsing. Social reformism came to its first inevitable debacle in 1914. Thus, when the capitalist powers, under stress of their urgent need for imperialistic expansion, launched into the World War, then logically, the opportunistically led socialist parties, whose interests had been identified with those of their respective capitalist classes, marched almost without exception into the war under the leadership of their bourgeois masters. This traitorous action by the reformistic socialist leaders advertised the bankruptcy of social reformism and split the Second International. Its inevitable consequence was the formation of the Revolutionary Comintern under the leadership of Lenin. The degeneration of social reformism, and of the Second International with it, proceeded rapidly. So that, when at the conclusion of the war a great wave of revolution swept through several European countries, it was the socialist leaders who defeated it. With their control of the masses of workers, and animated as these leaders were with a disbelief in the revolution and a firm resolve that at all costs they must maintain capitalism as a base from which to evolve into socialism, they proceeded to again violate the fundamental principles upon which the socialist movement had been founded, by helping the capitalists beat back the great revolutionary wave and keep intact the capitalist system of Europe. In Germany, at the close of the war in 1918, the workers, by a spontaneous upheaval, overthrew the Kaiser, dealt a great blow at the bourgeoisie and, traveling the path of the victorious Russian toilers, organized Soviets all over the country. But the German Social Democratic Party leaders, the reactionary Eberts, Nosks, Scheidmans, et al., who had not one whit of revolution in their whole being, were able to halt the German Revolution and to prevent the consolidation of its victory. They were responsible for demolishing the Soviets, setting up the Weimar Bourgeois Republic and eventually returning the political power to the capitalist class. And in the process they shot down hundreds of revolutionary workers, including the heroic Liebknecht and Luxemburg, who resisted this betrayal of the revolution. So shameless and open was the rescue of stricken German capitalism by the social democratic leaders that only the politically blind could fail to see it. The capitalists admitted it and the socialist leaders boasted about their saving capitalism. In a letter sent out to big capitalists by the National Association of German Manufacturers, the Morgans, DuPonts and Rockefellers of Germany, it is frankly said, in the first reconsolidation era of the bourgeois post-war regime, it was only due to the fact that the Social Democratic Party split the working class that it was possible for finance capital to maintain its rule. Thanks to its social character as being originally a workers' party, the social democracy brought into the system of reconsolidation at that time, 1918-19, in addition to its purely political force, something more valuable and endurable, namely, the organized working class, and while paralyzing their revolutionary energy chained them fast to the bourgeois state. If in 1936 humanity now faces the dreadful menace of fascism and the danger of a new and terrible world war, the chief responsibility for this situation rests with the German social democracy. In 1918 it had in its very hands the in my pamphlet, The Revolutionary Crisis in Germany, England, Italy and France, I have summed up the anti-revolutionary role of the social democracy in the post-war revolutionary upheavals. Opportunity to end capitalism and to establish socialism in Germany, which would have had a decisive effect in starting all Europe towards socialism. But the socialist leaders rejected that revolutionary opportunity, and instead they saved the capitalist system. And now we see in full flower the poisonous growth of their treachery, the present world threat of fascist terrorism and war. In Italy, in the post-war revolutionary wave of 1920, the workers and peasants, with a series of great strikes, developed a revolutionary attack that had the capitalist class helpless. But again the reformist socialist leaders smashed the whole movement, this time by peddling it for a few petty concessions. This action preserved the Italian capitalist system, and in the resultant proletarian demoralization Mussolini was able to develop his offensive and to set up the fascist state. The Socialist Party leaders, instead of being the grave diggers of capitalism, as Marx expressed the role of the working class, became its savior in several countries. The only reason they did not rescue the capitalist system in Russia also was because they did not control the masses who in November 1918 were following the lead of the revolutionary Bolsheviks. In the long post-war period also, from 1918 on, the mortally wounded capitalist system found its best nurse all over the world in the reformist socialist leaders who in many countries occupied key positions in the capitalist governments. Every step the capitalists deemed necessary to breathe the breath of life into their decaying system had the support of these false leaders. They used their prestige and power to induce or force the workers to accept low wages and unemployment uncomplainingly. They liquidated strikes and other sharp struggles of the workers. They endorsed the capitalist speed-up or rationalization of industry campaign and urged it upon the workers as the broad way to prosperity. They voted the growing war budgets. They slandered the Soviet Union in unmeasured terms. In India the British Labour Party government shot down rebellious workers and peasants, etc. In short, the socialist leaders were everywhere the willing helpers of stricken capitalism, and they did all their reactionary work in the name of socialism. But the bankruptcy of S.P. social reformism reached its climax in the coming to power of Hitler. When the finance capitalists of Germany, surrounded by insoluble difficulties, began to turn in the direction of fascist demagogy and terrorism in order to preserve their threatened social system, the socialist reformist leaders, true to their role as defenders of capitalism, began to orient themselves in the same direction. With millions of workers behind them and with the power in their hands to smash fascism, they would not fight it. They refused to make a united front with the communists and fight against the growing fascist menace, but instead, joined in the anti-Red Hunt. They voted for the Brüning government, which prepared the way for Hitler. They sacrificed the workers' civil rights. They called upon the masses to vote for Hindenburg, who after his election promptly turned the power over to Hitler. And to cap their betrayal of the working class, they voted, both the Social Democratic Party leaders and top trade union officials, to support the Hitler government. It was these misleaders of labor, preparers of the road for fascism, that the communists properly called social fascists. The opportunist socialist leaders thought they could find the place of loyal capitalist servants in the new fascist regime. But they learned to their amazement and dismay that the big capitalists, of whom the fascists are tools, were determined to repress everything that was not out-and-out fascist, not only the organizations of the communists, but also of the reformist socialists and even the mildest liberals and Catholics. Thereupon, the socialist leaders unresistingly allowed their huge party, trade unions, cooperatives, etc., to be completely wiped out without the slightest struggle, stubbornly refusing to make a united front with the communists against Hitler. Munists, it would have changed the political face of Europe. Hitler would have been smashed, fascism decisively defeated, and the now approaching World War staved off. Their failure to accept the CP's United Front proposals constituted another great tragedy added to the long and disastrous score of social reformism. It was a fitting follow-up to their betrayal of the 1918 German Revolution. In this surrender to Hitlerism, the S.P. social reformism reached its inevitable and complete bankruptcy. Even the Socialist Second International, which was equally to blame with the German Social Democratic Party, had to say the following. It is a fact that can never be blotted out of the history of social democracy that 48 social democratic members of the Reichstag out of the 65 present decided in favor of a vote of confidence in Hitler. The same war and post-war years also exposed the bank ruptcy of syndicalism, which is at bottom a form of social reformism, and showed conclusively that it was not a revolutionary force that could destroy capitalism. Even before the war, French syndicalism had lost the militancy and fighting spirit that had once attracted so much attention and fostered so many revolutionary hopes. It had discarded the use of the general strike, abandoned sabotage, and sunk pretty much to the level of pure and simple trade union social reformism. When the war came, its leaders, with but few exceptions, fully supported the French imperialist aims. And when the war was over, the once so fiery C.G.T. officials marched quite in step with the Social Democratic trade union and political leaders in their persistent efforts to save capitalism, to discredit the Soviet Union, and to head off the threatening general communist revolution. The C.G.T.'s reactionary course finally resulted, a dozen years ago, in a split in the organization of the communist-led C.G.T.U. Italian syndicalism, after the war, followed the same slippery trail into social reformism, the Union Sindacali, finally collapsing before the onrush of Italian fascism, and many of its leaders becoming officials in Mussolini's fake trade unions. In Spain, during this period, syndicalism ran likewise into paths of social reformism. And we have already seen how the American 1W, despite its brave stand in the war, has degenerated into a narrow, anti-Soviet sect. The syndicalist workers are revolutionary, but their traditional program is not. The bankruptcy of syndicalism is shown in 1936 when the Spanish workers, in spite of their anti-parliamentary theories, under the pressure of Iron Nice's city, first vote for the United Front electoral candidates and then bravely take up arms in defense of the Popular Front government. And they will also be forced by the same stern necessity, and alas, at the cost of serious defeats, even truly to drop their opposition to the dictatorship of the proletariat, to discard their naive illusions about the trade unions operating the industries under socialism, their false conceptions of decentralization and spontaneity, their resistance to political organization by the workers, their opposition to a centralized government and a disciplined army, etc. And the Spanish anarchist and syndicalist workers will be facilitated in learning these fundamental lessons by having as a guide the revolutionary experience of the Russian working class and its great Communist Party. The rise of the Communist movement. As the social democratic parties and trade unions, dominated by opportunist leaders, began to sink into the quagmire of social reformism long before the war started, a revolt of the more consciously revolutionary elements gradually took shape against the abandonment of the revolutionary goal of the socialist movement. This revolt began most sharply in Russia at the turn of the century and soon manifested itself in Germany and many other countries. The American S.P. splits of 1909 and 1912 were part of this growing, worldwide struggle against social reformism. The movement continued inside the socialist parties until they were eventually split altogether by the action of their leaders in supporting the World War. Then, in 1919, was born the Communist International, and the Communist parties crystallized themselves out of the S.P. left-wing, revolutionary syndicalists and an occasional anarchist, in nearly every country from England to China and from Canada to Chile. And even as I write this, in 1936, this revolt within the Second International against reformism takes on renewed scope and energy, caused by the manifest bankruptcy of its reformist leaders and the burning need for a united front and a fighting policy in the face of attack of fascism. The fight in the American Socialist Party against the old guard is just one phase of this new worldwide resurgence of revolutionary spirit inside the Second International. But I shall speak further of all this in the concluding chapters. The outstanding leader of the revolutionary struggle against social reformism in the workers' movement was Lenin, not only in Russia but also upon a world scale. Lenin was the greatest revolutionary thinker and practical leader since Marx. His viewpoint was based upon the principles of scientific socialism laid down by Marx and Engels. Stalin has defined Leninism as the Marxism of the epoch of imperialism and proletarian revolution. Manuelsky, at the 12th plenum of the Comintern, expanded Stalin's definition as follows. Lenin further developed the teachings of Marx and Engels for the epoch of imperialism and proletarian revolutions, analyzed the problems of monopolist capitalism, the proletarian dictatorship, the hegemony of the proletariat in the revolution, the role of the national colonial revolution, the party, and the problem of the successful construction of socialism in the period of the proletarian dictatorship. Lenin, far more than anyone else, worked out the program of the modern communist movement. Furthermore, he led in achieving its greatest practical success, the Russian Foundation's Leninism. Tion Lasovsky says of his role in the party, he was its theoretician, its man of action, agitator, propagandist, organizer and leader. He was soldier and general, teacher and pupil. But here is not the place to give a detailed presentation of Lenin's role or the principles of communism. In my book, Towards Soviet America, I have tried to give an outline of the methods and objectives of the communist movement. Now, I can only mention some of the major points developed by Lenin in his struggle against social reformism and for a revolutionary movement. Breaking with Marx's teachings, the social reformists, led by Bernstein, had developed the theory that capitalism was gradually overcoming its internal contradictions and heading towards a system of organized capitalism, with constantly improving living standards of the masses. There would be a progressive and inevitable evolution of capitalism into socialism through piecemeal reforms. Against this opportunist, non-revolutionary theory, Lenin fired his heaviest guns. By a masterly analysis of capitalist imperialism, he showed that, contrary to the assertions of the reformist socialist leaders, capitalism was approaching the end of its era of free expansion and was entering an imperialist period of decline and decay. He showed further that this imperialism inevitably produces ever deeper industrial crises, with wholesale impoverishment of the toiling masses, that it sharpens all class contradictions and also provokes gigantic armed conflicts between nations. He proved that imperialism is the era of wars and proletarian revolutions. This analysis has been brilliantly demonstrated since by the whole course of events. Lenin also shattered the reformist contention that the modern bourgeois state is a people's state which the workers can peacefully capture by votes and then utilize for the building of socialism. He demonstrated with crushing logic what Marx and Engels had long before proved, that the capitalist state is the but slightly disguised organized dictatorship of Lenin, the great strategist of the class war. The capitalist class. That no ruling class in history has ever given up its control without a violent struggle, and that, consequently, the revolutionary workers, in alliance with the peasantry and other exploited masses, must destroy the capitalist state in open struggle and set up their own state, a Soviet government, which is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin also carefully analyzed the composition and role of the new proletarian state. We need look only to the fascist terror in Germany, Italy and Spain to realize the correctness of this whole analysis of Lenin's and also the futility of the social reformists' plan of bringing socialism through purely legal parliamentary action. Lenin did not oppose fighting for economic and political reforms under capitalism. On the contrary, he realized fully that this daily fight for minor demands must be the starting point of the revolutionary struggle for the overthrow of capitalism. But such reforms must not be the end purpose of the movement, as the social reformists understood them. They are only byproducts of the revolutionary struggle, a means to defend the workers' standards and for the education, organization and disciplining of the working class in preparation for the final assault upon the capitalist system. The reformist socialist leaders, basing themselves upon the skilled workers and petty bourgeoisie, systematically disregarded the unskilled workers and the peasantry and, like the true imperialists they abandoned the oppressed masses in the colonial countries to the ruthless exploitation of the capitalist masters in the home imperialist countries. As against these narrow opportunist policies, Lenin developed a broad united front of all the exploited. He joined the unskilled with the skilled, organized an alliance between the workers and the poorer ranks of the peasantry and petty bourgeoisie, and linked together the proletarian revolutionary movement of the imperialist countries with the national liberation movements in the colonies. In the fight against war, Lenin ridiculed the reformist notion that imperialist wars could be stopped by pacifist propaganda and also the syndicalist theory that wars could be defeated by a folded arms, general strike. Lenin advocated that while every possible means should be used to hinder and make war more difficult, including anti-war agitation, general strike, etc., the fight against war must be based fundamentally upon the policy of transforming imperialist war into a war against the capitalist system, into a fight for the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. To carry out this revolutionary program, Lenin worked out the main foundations of the Communist Party. The party is based on the principle of the revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat. Instead of the amorphous membership of the socialist parties, it contains only the most advanced, best fighting elements of the working class. It is founded on democratic centralism and is infused with a strong discipline. Structurally, its basic units consist of nuclei of revolutionists in every institution where work of any kind is carried on. Factories, farms, schools, government, army, navy, etc. Only such a party, Lenin contended, can be truly revolutionary. It is incomparably better fitted than reformist socialist parties to lead the struggle on every field for the workers' economic, political and cultural demands, to lead them in the final overthrow of capitalism, and also in the construction of socialism. History, as the capitalist system crashed into the world war and general decline, put to the great test the communist movement, as well as the reformist socialist movement. We have seen what tragically pitiful results social reformism, with all its armies of voters, control of many governments, scores of millions of trade unionists and members of cooperatives, etc., finally led to: support of the World War, defeat of the proletarian revolution, demoralization of the working class, victory for fascism. But the budding communist movement came through this life and death test with flying colors. Scene: the workers and peasants in United Front Alliance under the leadership of the Communist Party with Lenin at its head, transformed the imperialist war into a civil war, smashed the capitalist system and set up the dictatorship of the proletariat in the form of the Soviet government. They made the first great breach in the world capitalist fortress. Then, in the face of the most stupendous obstacles and hardships ever confronted by any modern nation, economic blockade, armed intervention, civil war, famine, pestilence, economic collapse, sabotage, industrial and agricultural backwardness, etc., they forged ahead to the building of socialism in a country covering 1/6 of the land surface of the globe. Lenin's State and Revolution, written on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, is almost a blueprint of the revolution that followed in the Soviet government that emerged from it. Because of the unsoundness of the reformist socialist theories, Germany, Italy and Austria have been temporarily lost to the revolution and the world confronted with the horrors of fascism and another world war. And because of the non-revolutionary nature of anarchism and syndicalism, the revolutionary struggle in Spain, as I write this, is dangerously menaced. In the fiery test of the breaking up of the capitalist system, it is only the Leninist theory and practice, exemplified above all by the Soviet Union, that has proved victorious for the toiling masses and has led to the successful proletarian revolution and socialism. As social reformism sinks into decay and crisis, the communist Soviet Union, with its great party led now by Stalin, blazes ahead building socialist industry at a record pace, profoundly revolutionizing the medieval system of agriculture and swiftly raising the economic and cultural levels of the vast Russian masses. The Soviet Union, first great victory of the communist movement, has now become the hope of the oppressed millions of the earth, the leader and inspirer of all that is progressive and revolutionary in die world. It is the beginning of the new world era of socialism. 156 from Byran to Stalin. In every capitalist country also the growing communist parties, joined together in the Communist International, are struggling to educate, organize and lead in united front struggle the masses of exploited toilers of field and factory, demoralized by the bankruptcy of the policies of the reformist policies of the Second International and confused by the wild demagogy of fascism and the general reaction of the capitalist system in decay. The Comintern parties are the heart and leader of every real battle that takes place against capitalism in every corner of the world, as the heroic struggles of the workers and peasants in China, Germany, France, Austria, Spain, the Balkans and many other countries eloquently testify. But here it is impossible to review these struggles. I must now return to the immediate course of my narrative, to 1921 in Moscow. I become a communist. I remained in Moscow about 3.5 months and I most assiduously studied the communist movement in all its ramifications, the history and institutions of the revolution itself, the congresses of the Comintern and the R.I.L.U. I read widely in communist political literature. And as a result of my intense observations and reading I declared myself a communist. Syndicalists, with their anti-state, anti-political action theories, usually have considerable difficulty in understanding and accepting communism. But my whole experience of many years in the revolutionary movement had prepared me to readily become a communist. An especially powerful factor in predisposing me to accept the communist position was the highly intelligent way in which Lenin and the other Comintern leaders had handled the boring from within question, a problem over which American rebel leaders had broken their heads in vain for nearly 30 years. But more decisive still for me was the effect of the reality of the Russian Revolution itself. Evidently the communists were not only people who wanted a revolution, but, most important, had actually brought one about. A comparison of their achievements with those of other labor movements could have only one conclusion. At that time, in 1921, the Russian Revolution was in a day parade situation. The Civil War had just been ended successfully, but the country was prostrate from 7 years of war and revolution, during which it had passed through 1,000 valley forges. Industry had collapsed to only 10% of the pre-war volume and agriculture was also badly broken down. The country was suffering terribly from an economic blockade by the capitalist powers. Starvation stalked the land, about half a pound or so of black bread being the usual daily ration. In Moscow and other cities in the previous fierce winter, many people had burned for fuel the furniture and wood trimmings of their own dwellings. In whole sections of the cities there was no running water or electric lights. Hundreds of thousands fled the starved-out cities for the country where conditions were only slightly better. Counter-revolutionary upheavals in the villages and sabotage and strikes in the cities were the order of the day. Typhus and cholera ravaged the stricken country and medical supplies were almost nil. The horrible famine in the Volga districts was just beginning. It was indeed an appalling situation. For the building of socialism, the defeated capitalists and landlords, aided by the armies of some capitalist countries, had left only a mass of wreckage. But in the midst of this chaos and ruin, triumphant over its world of enemies, stood the brave Russian working class, led by the indomitable Communist Party with the great Lenin at its head, ready to begin the 10 times impossible task of socialist reconstruction in the backward, ruined country. Before I arrived in Moscow, I must admit that I was much in doubt as to the outcome of the Russian Revolution. Buried in the big packing house and steel campaigns, I had not found the opportunity to free myself from current opportunist conception that socialism could only be brought about in a highly industrialized country, but direct contact with the revolution almost immediately shattered this wrong opinion. It was soon as plain as a pikestaff to me that in Soviet Russia there had occurred a truly socialist revolution, just what I had been fighting for all my adult life. What mattered the difficulties of the situation? My class was fighting a desperate revolutionary struggle and my place was in its ranks to help however I could. I must stand shoulder to shoulder with the embattled Russian workers, win, lose or draw. And despite the staggering difficulties confronting the revolution, I became convinced, after a close study of the situation, that the workers would eventually win out. In my book, The Russian Revolution, published immediately after my return to the United States, I wrote as follows. The resolution is a bitter struggle, but I do not despair of the outcome. By their heroic and wonderful achievements in the past, the Russian workers breed confidence for their future. Although all the world said it could not be done, they solved the political problem of organizing and controlling the government in the face of great odds, and they solved the military problem by building a vast army and beating back their many foes. And they will solve the tremendous economic problem also. In my judgment, the Russian Revolution will live and accomplish its task of setting up the world's first free commonwealth. This optimism of mine has only been strengthened by the passage of the 15 years since I wrote the above, although the problems of the revolution have indeed at times been almost overwhelmingly difficult. I have made, during this period, numerous trips to the Soviet Union, in which I acquired some familiarity with the complicated Russian language, and I have been able to observe the revolution in nearly all its stages. I saw the success of Lenin's great new economic policy, which the capitalists and socialist leaders everywhere hailed as signaling the end of communism. I saw under Stalin's leadership the completion of the reconstruction of the old industries and the beginning of the building of the new industrial system. I witnessed the brilliant and successful fight led by Stalin against the disastrous opportunist programs proposed by Bukharin. I saw the defeat of the eventual renegades and assassins, Trotsky and Zinoviev. In wide travels through the U.S.S.R., I observed, at first hand, the accomplishment of the first 5-year plan and the beginning of the second, with their swift upbuilding of industry, tremendous collectivization of agriculture, strengthening of the armed defenses and raising of the cultural and economic levels of the great masses. In short, I have observed, in its various aspects, the rapid construction of a new socialist country, one which is showing the toilers of the world the way they must travel to emancipation out of the hell of capitalism. Asterisk. As a result of these trips to the U.S.S.R., I wrote 3 pamphlets. Russia in 292 carat, Russian Workers and Workshops in 1926, Victorious Socialist Construction, 1930. Although I was, in 1921, deeply certain that the Russian workers had found the way to socialism and eventual communism in Soviet Russia, I was not by that fact alone convinced that the communist program for achieving socialism was necessarily the best one for other countries, especially the United States. On the contrary, I weighed every phase of it in the light of American conditions and my own long experience in the class struggle. And the final result was that in Leninism I found the answer to every major revolutionary problem. To begin with, I did not have to be convinced in principle of the necessity for a revolutionary struggle to overthrow capitalism. A dozen years earlier I had recognized the futility of the Socialist Party's policy of trying to transform capitalism into socialism through piecemeal reforms, and my whole conception of syndicalism, even in its most opportunistic phases, had been based upon the proposition of smashing the power of the capitalists by the workers' superior force. All my experience in the class struggle fighting the cold-blooded, autocratic and ruthless American trusts had ground into my very being the realization that the ruling capitalist class will never allow itself to be talked, bought or voted out of power, but will proceed to any extreme of violence to maintain its control. But communism taught me many vital lessons regarding the forms and methods of carrying on this revolutionary struggle, including the policy of transforming an imperialist war into a revolutionary war against capitalism, the combination of revolutionary agitation and struggle with the daily fight of the workers for immediate demands, the united front of the workers and peasants. These policies had been so brilliantly illustrated in the Russian Revolution, and all of them, with adaptations to local situations, are applicable and indispensable in every capitalist country. As to the question of revolutionary political action, I found myself accepting this without difficulty, though I had been a syndicalist for a dozen years. During later years, as a result of my own experience, especially in the meatpacking and steel campaigns, the need for political action had been gradually dawning upon me, and I began more and more to feel that it was not a wise policy that tried to restrict the struggle of the workers solely to the economic field. Indeed, as I have stated earlier, so much had my views on political action changed that in 1920 I had already become active in the Labor Party movement then centering in Chicago. I became further convinced of the need for political action as I watched with misgivings the weakening of syndicalism in France. Spain, Italy and other countries, and besides, did I not see, in passing through London on my way to Moscow, the shameful collapse of the triple alliance of miners, railroaders and transport workers that we syndicalists had so much counted on? And, most important of all, had not the Russian Revolution itself completely exposed the futility of syndicalism? The cup of my disillusionment with anti-political syndicalism was filled to overflowing by the unrevolutionary, to put it mildly, actions of the syndicalists and anarchists in fighting the heroic Communist Party and the Soviet government at the first R.I.L.U. Congress. Been to convince me that political action is fundamentally necessary for the workers and that without it successful class struggle is impossible. Many syndicalists and other sincere workers also have much difficulty in understanding the role of the Soviet government, which is the state form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is because they are afflicted with illusions as to nature of the state and the possibility of society going by one easy leap from capitalism to a perfected socialism or communism. They ignore the whole problem of the transition period. It did not take much observation for me to see, however, that in the Soviet Union a strong state, sternly enforcing the will of the revolutionary proletariat, was indispensable to the maintenance of the workers' rule and the building of socialism, and that it was the preliminary stage to the eventual stateless communist society. Had the Russian workers been unwise enough to try to build the new society by the way of a general all-class democratic government, according to the socialist plan, or through a system of trade union control, as the syndicalists propose, or according to the anarchist notion of simply relying on the spontaneous activities of the masses, the revolution would have been soon undermined and destroyed by its many class enemies at home and abroad. These hostile elements, always ripe for intrigue, sabotage and insurrection, had to be held in check, and they were, through the dictatorship of the proletariat. To do this was the first condition for the workers' and peasants' victory. I was quite convinced also that when the revolution comes in the United States, the workers and their allies will have no less need for the dictatorship of the proletariat. 162 From Byran to Stalinomic, political and cultural bases of die erstwhile ruling class have been completely destroyed. And the best possible form of such a revolutionary state is the Soviet, a system of government, based on direct representation from the factories, mines, railroads, farms, army, etc., which sets up the broadest democracy among the toiling masses and presents the most solid fighting front against the class enemy. The strong discipline of the Russian Communist Party has also caused much question among workers, especially syndicalists and anarchists. But such hesitations are only expressions of the petty bourgeois individualism to which the capitalist environment has exposed them. As for myself, even my preliminary observations of the Russian Revolution in 1921 completely cleared up this matter for me. With my opportunity to study it, only the veriest political tyro could fail to see that without such a disciplined party there could have been no Bolshevik revolution in the first place, nor could the workers have retained political power once they got it. After carefully studying the Russian Communist Party, with its combination of centralism and inter-party democracy, with its foundation nuclei rooted in the factories, farms, schools, army, etc., with its membership of the best fighting elements of the working class and poorer peasantry, and with its record of victory in the face of superhuman difficulties, I was inevitably drawn to the conclusion which I expressed at the time, that the Russian Communist Party was the highest type of organization ever produced by mankind. Nor did it require much further thought for me to realize that in fighting the powerful American capitalist class, the workers of this country, bearing in mind their own special conditions, would do well to build their party on the basic lines of the great Communist Party of Soviet Russia. I also accepted without difficulty the communist policy of a strong, centralized international, the Comintern. Manifestly, such an organization is necessary to fight world capitalism, and the Comintern has shown in its activities that it can guide the world revolutionary movement. Turn leaders are incomparably the best body of Marxians anywhere. They are flooded with information from all countries. They have had an enormous personal experience, especially the Russians, many of whom have lived in various countries, speak several languages, and have passed through 3 revolutions in their own country. Such a center, better informed than any socialist body, capitalist government or economic organization, and following a consistent revolutionary policy, is incomparably more fit to lead the international revolutionary movement than the autonomous, opportunistic socialist Second International. Only after thus considering communism, not alone with regard to the Russian Revolution, but especially as to the applicability of its program to the United States, did I declare myself a communist. My previous 9 years in the Socialist Party and dozen years in the syndicalist movement, I.W.S.L. of N.A. and I.T.U.E.L., as well as 20 years of membership in various trade unions, had given me a pretty broad theoretical and practical experience upon which to base my decision. It became clear to me, therefore, that the communist program was the one that spelled the doom of capitalism and the foundation of the new social order. Socialism, in all countries. So, when I returned to the United States, in the middle of 1921, one joined the Communist party and took my proper place in the ranks of the Revolutionary Communist International. And the passage of the ensuing 15 years, with their continued progress in the Soviet Union, breakdown of capitalist economy, collapse of social reformism and growth of fascism, has only served to justify my 1921 decision and to convince me of the correctness of the Communist program. Chapter 12. The Trade Union. Educational League. Upon our delegation's return from Moscow in the fall of 1921, we began an active campaign to build the T.U.E.L., which, as I have stated, had been organized in November 1920. We established the Labor Herald in Chicago, with Earl R. Browder as editor. We set up groups in many cities. The T.U.E.L. held its first national conference in Chicago, August 26 to 27, 1922. Present were 45 delegates from 26 cities, including 4 in Canada. The looseness of the T.U.E.L. groups prevented any exact statistics as to the number of workers represented. Program of the T.U.E.L. The T.U.E.L. program was developed chiefly in a number of documents, including a. The initiatory statement of principles *, b. The bankruptcy of the American labor movement f, and c. The resolutions of the first T.U.E.L. National Conference. Here it is possible to emphasize only the central points of this program. The initiatory statement thus outlines the general aims of the T.U.E.L. The Trade Union Educational League proposes to develop the trade unions from their present antiquated and stagnant condition into powerful, modern labor organizations, capable of waging successful warfare against capital. To this end, it is working to revamp and remodel from top to bottom their theories, tactics, structure and leadership. Instead of advocating the prevailing shameful and demoralizing nonsense about onanizing, the Labor Herald, March 1922. F.A. pamphlet written by myself. The interests of capital and labor, it is firing the workers' imagination and releasing their wonderful idealism by propagating the inspiring goal of the abolition of capitalism and the establishment of a workers' republic. The resolutions of the First National Conference Summa Ris the T.U.E.L. program as follows. 1. Categoric rejection of dual unionism. 2. Repudiation of the A.F. of L. policy of class collaboration and adoption of the principle of class struggle. 3. For industrial unionism through amalgamation of the existing unions. 4. The organization of the unorganized. 5. For unemployment insurance. 6. For a labor party. 7. For the shop delegate system in the unions. 8. Affiliation of the American labor movement to the R.I.L.U. 9. Wholehearted support of the Russian Revolution. 10. The abolition of the capitalist system and the establishment of a workers' republic. To accomplish these purposes, the T.U.E.L. proposed the formation of a broad united front. The working theory of the T.U.E.L. is the establishment of a left progressive bloc of all the revolutionary and progressive elements in the trade unions, as against the autocratic machine of the reactionary bureaucracy. The T.U.E.L. program put special emphasis upon the development of industrial unionism by amalgamation. In my pamphlet, The Bankruptcy of the American Labor Movement, its theory of industrial unionism as the normal climax of trade union growth and evolution is stated as follows. As the workers feel the need for more united action, they build up and extend their old unions and then strike up closer and closer affiliations with sister organizations. Sooner or later, the unions in all industries and in all countries find themselves at the point where they are based upon industrial rather than craft lines. So in arriving at this stage of development, they ordinarily pass through a more or less lengthy evolutionary process marked by 3 distinct phases, which I shall call 1. Isolation, 2. Federation, 3. Amalgamation. The bankruptcy of the American labor movement. Organizationally, the T.U.E.L. followed much the same lines as the old S.L. of N.A. and the I.T.U.E.L. The membership consisted only of members of trade unions. There were no dues, finances being secured by sale of the journal and literature, by collections at meetings, etc., and a voluntary sustaining fund of $1 per year. The local industrial and general groups paralleled the local unions, district councils and central labor councils of the trade unions. The local industrial groups were joined up nationally into 14 national industrial sections, each of which had its own name, secretary, journal, funds, program, etc. Austin Sibley, they were independent bodies, only one, the needle trades, being known officially as a section of the T.U.E.L. There were 4 territorial sections: Canadian, Eastern States, Central States and Pacific Coast. The T.U.E.L. National Committee formally consisted of the secretaries of the national industrial sections. Provisionally, however, a small board was elected at the National Conference, with the industrial secretaries to be added as soon as their sections could be organized. The TUEL was affiliated to none of the revolutionary parties, but eventually joined the Federated Farmer Labor Party on the same basis as other labor organizations. The TUEL was the recognized American section of the RILU, a prospect of struggle. The TUEL found the situation among militant and revolutionary workers quite favorable for its work. The traditional hard shell of dual unionism had been finally smashed by the clear-cut decisions of the CI and the RILU. Now we veteran Boers from within found receptive ears on all. Later there were two more added, the Red International Affiliation Committee, comprising the TUEL minority in the IWW, and the Red International Committee which, with headquarters in New York, linked up the RILU independent unions with the TUEL on a 50-50 basis of representation. Sides. The underground Communist Party, at that time establishing unity, strongly endorsed the TUEL and made its upbuilding a central party task, its legal expression. The Workers' Party did likewise. The left wing of the IWW also endorsed the TUEL and affiliated to it. After the deep communist splits of 1919-21 there was very little of a left wing remaining in the SP. But Debs wrote an article for the Labor Herald endorsing the general line of the TUEL. The Proletarian Party, although with many hesitations, also gave the TUEL its endorsement, and in New York, the small RILU independent unions supported the TUEL. The United Toilers, a communist split-off, also endorsed the TUEL, but the sectarian SLP continued to support its traditional dual unionism. This all sounds like very much support, but in reality, because of the long persistence of dual unionism, very few of these revolutionaries were members of the trade unions, much less influential in them. In addition to these left-wing affiliations, the TUEL developed cooperative relations with the Farmer Labor Party group headed by John Fitzpatrick. This was an outgrowth of our joint activities in the packing house and steel campaigns of 1917-20. J.G. Brown, National Secretary of the FLP, and former organizer in steel, became a member of the TUEL National Committee, and Fitzpatrick looked upon our movement with a friendly eye. Together with this substantial support, there was a favorable objective basis for TUEL struggle in the huge series of strikes then going on. It was in the latter phase of the great 1919-22 post-war open shop offensive of the employers to smash the trade unions and to take away from the workers the 8-hour day, higher wages and better working conditions they had won during the war. Part of this general employers' offensive was the ferocious Palmer, Department of Justice, 1919-20, attack upon the nascent communist movement, arresting thousands of its members in driving the two communist parties underground, where they remained until the end of 1922. The employers were facilitated in their offensive by the sharp industrial crisis of that period and by the vigorous government use of courts, police, troops, etc., against the workers. But the workers fought back militantly. They replied with the greatest series of strikes in American labor history. The number of strikers totaled over 8 million, practically every major industry: steel, meatpacking, coal, marine transport, metal mining, textile, clothing, building, lumber, railroads, automobile, printing, etc., being involved, and nearly every union had to fight for its very existence. The workers fought bravely, but because of shameless sabotage and betrayal by the leadership, who were still dreaming of the class peace of wartime days, the great strikes were nearly all lost. A main cause of this were the craft divisions between the unions, the leaders repeatedly keeping one set of unions at work in an industry while the rest were striking, and thereby defeating them all. The A.F. of L and independent unions decreased by about 1 million members, and the unions were wiped out in several industries. It was the worst defeat ever suffered by the trade union movement in this country. The TUEL goes into battle. Early in 1922, without waiting for its first national conference, the TUEL plunged into the raging class struggle. Although it was a new organization and but little known, it managed to catch the attention of the embattled workers and to play an active role in several of the big strikes in the end phases of the Great Open Shop Offensive. In these strug, in its legal form the Communist Party was successively called Workers' Party, Workers' Communist Party and Communist Party. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics gives the following figures. Greater than 9 feet 9. 4,160,348 1921. 1,099,247 greater than 920. M63 greater than degree 54 1922. 1,612,552. Glace the Communist Party gave the T.U.E.L. maximum support. The first success of the T.U.E.L. was in the Great Coal Strike of 1922. The miners were fighting a desperate national struggle against an attempt to smash their union, when, suddenly Frank Farrington, president of the Illinois U.M.W.A., later proved to be a paid agent of the Peabody Coal Company, tried to break the strike by signing a separate state agreement. In southern Illinois the T.U.E.L. had already won the support of the leaders of the great 1919 outlaw strike of 70,000 miners, including Slinger, Corbishley, Thompson, etc., and with them it was able to mobilize great mass meetings of miners which rejected Farrington's treachery and thereby, without doubt, saved the national strike and probably the U.M.W.A. itself. The T.U.E.L. also played a big role in the bitterly fought Chicago building trades strike of the spring of 1922 against the Open Shop Landis Award. Its militants, Crumbine, John Stone, Kajar and others, were powerful forces in stiffening the workers in their struggle against the bosses, the government and their own treacherous trade union leaders. The rapidly forming T.U.E.L. groups also played an important role in strengthening the several big New York needle trades strikes of this period. The climax of the Great Open Shop Drive came in the National strike of the 400,000 railroad shopmen of 1922. Here again the T.U.E.L. was able to take a very important part. It sent out several speakers, including myself, to work among the striking railroaders. Asterisk in the Omaha Central Labor Council T.U.E.L. militants had adopted a resolution call. On this speaking tour I was kidnapped from the Oxford Hotel in Denver by Colorado State Rangers under command of the notorious Pat Hamrock. After a night in jail at Brighton Incommunicado, they drove me to Cheyenne, Ohio, and turned me over to the sheriff there. With a couple of deputies, the latter drove me several hours across Wyoming, finally dumping me out on the road 10 miles from Torrington, Neb. In the ensuing fall elections, W.E. Sweet, Democratic candidate for governor, made my kidnapping case a central issue and was elected. During his term of office the state rangers were dissolved, for lack of sustaining finances from the state legislature. Aiming for a general strike of all workers nationally to smash the strike-breaking Doherty federal injunction against the railroad strike. The response was so great from 200 other labor centers that Gompers declared that never before in his experience had he known such a demand for a general walkout. The T.U.E.L. movement in this strike culminated in a big national amalgamation conference of 400 delegates in Chicago, December 9, 1922. Much of this railroad work was done through the Minnesota Shopcrafts Legislative Committee, headed by O. Wangerin, which finally became the T.U.E.L. National Railroad Section. The T.U.E.L. also helped to develop a broad United Front movement to defend the communists arrested at the C.P. Underground Convention held in Bridgman, Michigan, in August 1922. The federal government, seeking to paralyze the growing influence of the Communist Party, had swooped down upon the convention and arrested 32 delegates, later indicting 40 more. A couple of days afterward they raided the first T.U.E.L. conference in Chicago and arrested 11 delegates. Among the T.U.E.L. leaders arrested at the convention and conference were Browder, Dunn, Johnston, Crumbine, Ehrenberg and myself. Wide support was developed in the unions for the defendants. I was tried first and got a hung jury. Next came C.E. Ruthenberg, secretary of the C.P., who was framed up and convicted of violating the state criminal syndicalism law. He died, however, as his appeal was pending in the courts. The cases lingered on for 11 years and were only finally dismissed in 1933. During the period in question the T.U.E.L. carried on an active campaign for affiliation of the trade unions to the R.I.L.U. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers voted a fraternal affiliation and the Canadian T.U.E.L., led by Tim Buck, secured a direct R. U affiliation from the Nova Scotia Miners, U.M.W.A., the only A.F. of L body ever so, for an analysis of the T.U.E.L. Railroad movement. Read my pamphlet, The Railroaders' Next Step Amalgamation. To affiliate, the T.U.E.L. also conducted broad campaigns for Mooney and Billings, Sacco and Vanzetti, the I.W.W. prisoners and other class war victims. Amalgamation, Labor Party, recognition of Soviet Russia. Although the T.U.E.L. made its influence deeply felt in many of the struggles of these stormy days, it scored its swiftest and greatest successes in its big triple drive for amalgamation, for a Labor Party and for recognition of Soviet Russia. It conducted a nationwide offensive with all its forces for these three issues. The whole labor movement was shaken by its campaign. Great masses of trade unionists rallied to the T.U.E.L. slogans. More than one half of the trade union movement openly supported one or all its three central demands. Within a few months the T.U.E.L. had made them the main issues confronting the A.F. of L. and railroad brotherhoods. The huge response to these three T.U.E.L. slogans evidenced the existing wave of radicalization among the masses. The workers saw in industrial unionism through amalgamation on the road to real unity and power, the way to organize the unorganized and to stop the disastrous situation of one group of unions in an industry working while the rest were striking, which had proved so ruinous in the recent great railroad, building, printing and other strikes, and which was the outstanding weakness of the packing house and steel campaigns. The workers saw in the Labor Party an effective answer, on the one hand, to the broken promises and strike-breaking troops, courts and police of the government, and on the other, to the fatal nonpartisan political policy of the A.F. of L leaders. And in their wide demand for the recognition of Soviet Russia, the workers expressed their natural proletarian solidarity with the new socialist republic. In the T.U.E.L. campaign as a whole they saw the way opening to a more honest, powerful and effective labor movement. The organized forces behind this big T.U.E.L. movement took the form of a broad united front of left-wingers and progressives. The Communist Party and the T.U.E.L. were the driving left-wing forces, while the progressives, chiefly the Fitzpatrick Knowles Farmer Labor Party group, cooperated sympathetically. It was essentially a continuation and growth of the combination that had carried through the packing house and steel campaigns. The movement centered in Chicago, and the amalgamation campaign proper took its national impetus from the adoption by the Chicago Federation of Labor on March 19, 1922, of a resolution, presented by T.U.E.L. delegates, which, after reciting the tragedy of craft disunity, concluded as follows. Resolved, that we, the Chicago Federation of Labor, in regular meeting, call upon the American Federation of Labor to take the necessary action toward bringing about the required solidarity within the ranks of organized labor, and that, as a first start in this direction, the various international unions be called into conference for the purpose of arranging to amalgamate all the unions in the respective industries into single organizations, each of which shall cover one industry. Reactionaries, led by Vice President Nelson, fought against this resolution, but were voted down by 114 to 37. Then followed a big national T.U.E.L. sweep under the slogan, Amalgamation or Annihilation. During the next 18 months the Chicago Resolution was widely endorsed and the solidarity movement expressed itself in many get-together tendencies. 16 international unions, including the railway clerks, railway maintenance of way, iron molders, butcher workmen, typographical union, bakery workers, lithographers, brewery workers, amalgamated clothing workers, furriers, amalgamated food workers, bookbinders, metal polishers, firefighters, textile workers and shoe workers voted outright for amalgamation, while the ladies, garment workers, railroad trainmen, railroad firemen and several other internationals voted for federation or partial amalgamation. Likewise, 17 state federations of labor, including such important bodies as those of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Oregon, Nebraska, Washington, South Dakota, Utah, Colorado, etc., adopted amalgamation resolutions. Besides this, scores of central labor councils and thousands of local unions took similar action. We were well within the truth when we declared at the time that more than 2 million workers, or about one-half the organized trade union movement, responded to the T.U.E.L. amalgamation slogan. From Canada, Tim Buck reported, amalgamation resolutions have been endorsed during the past year by almost every kind of union in every part of Canada, including the Alberta Federation of Labor and 7 of the largest central labor councils, or, all told, over 50% of the members affiliated to the trades. Congress of Canada. The campaign for the Labour Party was also very effective. The Labour Party movement had sprung up spontaneously at many points in the years 1918 to 20, especially in Minnesota, New York and Chicago. But the poor showing in the national elections of 1920 had paralyzed the newly formed Farmer Labour Party, and it lingered along, more dead than alive, under the control of the Fitzpatrick-Nockels C.F. of L. group. Then, in agreement with Fitzpatrick, the Workers' Party, legal form of the C.P. and the T.U.E.L. began to push the Labour Party issue. Result: an upsurge that was even more extensive than the amalgamation movement. Many international unions, state federations of labor, central labor councils and local unions voted for the Labour Party. During this campaign the T.U.E.L. put out a non-tional referendum to 35,000 local unions on the Labour Party question and received over 7,000 endorsements, and doubtless many more locals endorsed it without notifying us. The Labour Party movement culminated in the Chicago, July 3, 1923, convention, but of that, more anon. The fight for the recognition of Soviet Russia also took on, for a full statement of amalgamation movement, read J. Fox's pamphlet, Amalgamation. 274 From Byran to Stalin, a broad scope. At this time Soviet Russia was suffering from the 1921 Volga District famine, so the recognition issue was linked up with the collection of relief funds by the Friends of Soviet Russia, led by A. Wagenknecht, and the Trade Union National Committee for Russian Famine Relief, headed by Joe Manley, and including such progressives as W. H. Johnston, Tim Healy, etc. The recognition demand was supported by many internationals, such as the teachers, miners, stationary firemen, locomotive engineers, Machen ISDS, printers, etc., as well as by innumerable state federations, central bodies and local unions. These were prosperous times for the T.U.E.L. It was indeed giving a graphic demonstration of the feasibility of boring from within. Its prestige grew rapidly, and its loose groups and movements sprang up in many centers. It had fairly leapt from a small sect to a real power in the labor movement. The T.U.E.L. received high praise from the R.I.L.U. for the effective work being done. The Gompers bureaucracy on the defensive. Naturally, the T.U.E.L. had not scored its big successes on amalgamation, the Labour Party and Russian recognition, without coming into a head-on collision with the A.F. of L. leadership. These reactionaries hated and feared all three issues. They realized the movement would soon pass from agitation to decisive action, unless swiftly crushed. In amalgamation they could see the eventual loss of thousands of their fat jobs and the end of their class collaboration policies. The Labour Party meant for them severing their corrupt alliances with the two capitalist parties, and recognition of Soviet Russia would be a blow in the teeth from their worst enemies, the communists. They understood clearly that the victory of our movement would mark the end of their reactionary regime and the beginning of a new progressive period for the unions. They got a foretaste of the real meaning of the T.U.E.L. program and its force in the Big Detroit Trade Union Educational League 175 Convention of the Railroad Maintenance of Way Workers, where 1,500 delegates adopted the whole T.U.E.L. MDA program and then fired 19 out of 21 top officials, including their president, Grable, who had betrayed the 1922 railroad strike by keeping his union at work despite its vote to join the strike. Hence, the A.F. of L bureaucrats fought us bitterly. They filled the unions and the capitalist press with shrieks that the T.U.E.L. was a dual union, that the Reds were out to destroy the A.F. of L and that we had received vast sums of money from Moscow to finance our work. The federal government joined in the latter lying charges. But these wild accusations went largely unheeded by the workers. The T.U.E.L. progress continued unabated. Union after union declared for its three key slogans. The A.F. of L leaders were discredited by their strike-breaking tactics in the great post-war offensive of the bosses, and the workers were taking the situation into their own hands. Earl R. Beckner, Journal of Political Economy, August 1925, in an article on the T.U.E.L. and quoting the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, says, the U.S. Department of State has obtained information, which it declares to be reliable, that Foster brought to the U.S. from Moscow the sum of greater than 40,000, and that in April 1923, the T.U.E.L. received an additional $90,000. He says further that Lasovsky, head of the R.I.L.U., who has never in his life been in the U.S., brought us still another $35,000 to the Bridgman Convention of the C.P. all of which was a tissue of lies. The A, F, of L leaders were forced into the defensive and they began to show signs of demoralization. Their weakened position was illustrated, for example, by the fact that at the very important Ohio State Federation of Labor Convention in 1922, Joe Manley, with no preparatory work whatever, went to the convention and got its almost unanimous endorsement of our amalgamation resolution, despite the efforts of the top officials to defeat him. And in Chicago, after our first victory on amalgamation, the reactionaries announced loudly through the press that they would come en masse to the next C, F, of L meeting and repudiate our resolution. But the result was they were beaten even worse than before, by a vote of 103 to 14. Gompers, the old fox, was highly upset by all these developments, as he knew quite well their import. So, 3 days after the second vote in the C, F, of L, he came to Chicago. He did not dare to attend the hostile C, F, of L meeting, so he assembled a hand-picked conference of 1,500 Union officials in the Morrison Hotel. He called upon them to take the C, F, of L out of the hands of the Reds at all costs. It was an appeal to use violence. But even this carefully selected meeting was sympathetic to amalgamation. I was present and, among others, defended our cause. Gompers lost his head and challenged me to debate the whole question with him publicly. Eagerly I accepted, both at the meeting itself and through the Labor Herald, but Gompers thought better of his challenge and finally ignored the whole matter. And nothing came of his call upon the reactionaries to capture the C, F, of L. By force. We prepared to repel the attack, they, no doubt, feeling themselves too weak for the job. The surrender of the progressives. It was a dangerous situation for the Gompers leaders and, if continued, would have certainly led to their overthrow. They were badly discredited by their strike breaking and disruption during the post-war strike struggles. Their own ranks were split during this period by the formation of the Big Conference for Progressive Political Action movement, and now they were facing an awakening rank and file led by revolutionaries using the new and strange policy of boring from within. The Gompers clique, for the first time in their history, were actually seriously threatened. Indeed, taking advantage of the situation, right wing of the C, P, A group, headed by President William H. John Stalin of the Machinists, were already openly planning to capture Gompers' throne. But meanwhile, even as the T, U, E, L movement surged ahead, counter-currents were developing which were to swiftly and dramatically remove the conservative leaders from all danger and to place them more firmly than ever in control of the trade union movement. A whole new situation was developing, one that put a sudden stop to the stormy advance of the T, U, E, L, and gave the broad trade union movement a new and disastrous policy. The basic thing that caused this great change was the beginning, about the 1st of 1923, of the long, so-called Coolidge period of prosperity. This rapidly changed the whole situation. As the Depression waned, the bosses dropped their union-smashing, wage-cutting tactics and secured intensified exploitation of the workers through working them harder. They began the tremendous drive of the next several years for the speed-up or rationalization of industry, which accomplished great increases in the workers' output and realized huge profits for the bosses. The movement soon spread all over the industrial world and exerted profound effects economically, politically and socially. In the next chapter I shall deal more fully with this big movement. Here let me confine myself simply to saying briefly that the trade union leaders immediately based their whole policy upon cooperating with the employers to cheapen production and to increase the exploitation of the workers. In line with this policy, they assiduously set about cultivating prosperity illusions among the masses and shooting to pieces our dangerous rank and file movement which fought for a class struggle program. The reactionary trade union leaders were helped in all this reactionary course by a change in front of the progressives. Dropping all pretense of struggle, these vacillating elements fitted themselves entirely into the new intensified class collaboration and speed-up policies of the bosses, and indeed became their most ardent champions. The first of the progressives to so hoist the white flag were the right-wing LA Ments. These, grouped around the railroad unions, were organized in the Conference for Progressive Political Action, and were led by such men as Johnston, Stone and Hillman. The Socialist Party was also an active factor in this organization. The C, P, A contained about 3 million organized workers and farmers. These masses clearly wanted a labor party, but their progressive leaders, after talking radically about a labor party during the period of sharpest struggle, sensed the new turn of events towards class collaboration, and therefore ran the whole movement into tire ditch. At the Cleveland, December N. 1922, conference of the C. P. A. They definitely repudiated the plan of forming a labor party, endorsed the A. F. of L nonpartisan policy and, making complete peace with the A. F. of L leaders, they soon all set sail together for the Lafayette fiasco of 1924. The right-wing progressives then completed their surrender by unceremoniously dumping overboard their plum plan of government railroad ownership, canceling their inter-union solidarity agreements and soon becoming the very leaders in the developing movement for intensified class collaboration. Our split with the Fitzpatrick Group. The left wing of the progressives, the Fitzpatrick Farmer Labor Party group, with whom the T, U, E, L, and W, P, C, P, were cooperating, held out several months longer against the new conservative trends in the labor movement, but they also finally went to the right. Fitzpatrick had denounced the Cleveland decisions of the C, P, P, A, as rank betrayal of the Labor Party movement and had formally agreed with the Workers' Party to call a national convention in Chicago, July 3, 1923, at which a new Labor Party would be launched, provided there were at least 500,000 workers represented. The W, P, was officially invited to attend the convention, and it accepted, but the Socialist Party, which followed the line of the right progressives into the camp of Lafayette and intensified class collaboration, declined the invitation. It was in the months preceding this 1923 convention that the T, U, E, L, and the Workers' Party campaign for the Labor Party took on its broadest mass character. Meanwhile, the Gompers leaders, strengthened by the rising wave of prosperity, the growth of class collaboration policies, the decline in the workers' fighting spirit, the spread of prosperity illusions among the toilers and the collapse of the C, P, P, A, felt themselves able to begin to put pressure on the Fitzpatrick-Nockels group. In June 1923, therefore, they cut off 50% of the C, F, of L's monthly subsidy and threatened to reorganize the C, F, of L if it did not break its alliance with the communists and stop agitating for amalgamation, the Labor Party and Russian recognition. This coercion had an effect and the C, F, of L leaders began visibly to lose interest in the coming Labor Party convention. When the July 3 convention assembled, there were present some 600 delegates representing over 600,000 organized workers and farmers, besides several important unions, A, C, W and others, that sent observers. From the start it was evident that the Fitzpatrick Group wanted to break its relations with the Workers' Party, although, only shortly before, they had specifically invited it to the convention. They hemmed and hawed with various maneuvers to this end, finally, on the last day of the convention, submitting a proposal to exclude the W, P, on the grounds that it advocated the overthrow of the government and asking all present except the W, P, to affiliate to the old moribund Fitzpatrick, F, L, P. The convention delegates, of whom only a very small minority were communists, roared disapproval of this course, and by a vote of 500 to 40 established the originally planned Federated Farmer Labor, of which Joe Manley was elected secretary. Whereupon Fitzpatrick and a handful of delegates walked out of the convention. Nearly all of his customary supporters, however, including such veterans as Alex Howard, Duncan MacDonald, Mother Jones, etc., endorsed the W, P, line in the convention. They could not see the consistency of Fitzpatrick's first condemning the C, P, P, A couple of months before for not seating W, P, delegates and denouncing it as a scab organization for not launching a Labor Party and then, suddenly switching front, taking essentially the same course himself in this big convention. Although supported by only a few delegates, nevertheless the Fitzpatrick walkout became a real break. The capitalist papers helped it decisively by yelling, "Split," in 1,000 headlines all over the country. This split, combined with the general trend of the A, F, of L and organized farmers towards the candidacy of Lafayette, prevented the growth of the newly organized F, L, P, and it perished after a 12 months lingering existence. The Fitzpatrick Farmer Labor Party also soon died out, with its leaders turning more and more back to the A, F, of L, nonpartisan political policy. Fitzpatrick has many times since bitterly attacked the communists for the July 3 split. But this is not in accordance with the facts. The main responsibility lay with himself. We simply stuck to the plan we had definitely agreed upon with Fitzpatrick before the convention, of forming a new, federated party. It was he who directly caused the split, in his eagerness to break with the communists and to put himself in tune with the strong conservative trends developing at the time in the trade union movement. The worst that we can be fairly charged with was an error in tactics. As I have pointed out, Fitzpatrick and his group, feeling the upswing of prosperity and the growth of class collaboration, were at the time retreating rapidly to the right under Gomper's fire. This trend on their part was clearly demonstrated afterwards by Fitzpatrick's giving up the Labor Party movement altogether and reverting back to the A, F, of L nonpartisan policy, by abandoning amalgamation and by becoming a bitter enemy of the Soviet Union. He also became an ardent advocate of all the subsequent A, F, of L schemes of intensified class collaboration. Our failing was that we should have realized more clearly all this rightward trend and, instead of holding Fitzpatrick to his pre-Convention agreement, made the greatest compromises in order, if possible, to avoid such an open and sharp break. The whole history of the next several years showed, with the progressives generally gone far to the right and becoming the leaders of the class collaboration movement, that the W, P, and T, U, E, L, with their class struggle policy, were bound to have the greatest difficulty in carrying on any joint struggle whatever with them. Nevertheless, we should have fought more skillfully against the split. As it was, the split developed in the worst form, dramatically and around such a major issue as the Labor Party. The sequel showed that the Chicago split cost the W.P. loss of contacts with many important farmer labor militants in various sections of the country. It shattered the United Front combination that had done such effective work in the meatpacking and steel campaigns and in the amalgamation, Labor Party and other movements, and that held promise of important future activities. The A.F. of L. counter-offensive. The Chicago split in the United Front between the Communists and left progressives was manna from heaven to the threatened Gompers leaders, and they accepted it as a signal for a big offensive against the T.U.E.L., the Communists and progressive movements generally. The first serious clash came at the Illinois Federation of Labor Convention in Decatur, September 10, 1923, at which I was a delegate. This was said to be the largest state federation convention ever held in the U.S., the A.F. of L having made a big mobilization of its forces to defeat us. Gompers had sent out a special letter condemning us and delegated Matthew Wall to lead the fight against us. The battle centered around the question of amalgamation, and it was a hot fight. The Fitzpatrick, F. L. P. delegates, very bitter at us for the Chicago split, joined forces openly with Wall, signed his statement condemning amalgamation, and helped vote down their own C.F. of L amalgamation resolution. Result: amalgamation was defeated by a 4-to-1 vote, whereas 3 months before it would have been adopted by the same delegation with an overwhelming majority. This was the first time the A.F. of L leaders had been able to defeat amalgamation in any state federation convention, and their jubilation knew no bounds. Just at this critical time, with the Gompers machine man aging to get on the offensive against us, the Socialist Needle Trades Union leaders taught the right reactionaries a new trick in how to fight militant unionism. In the International Ladies' Garment Workers, where our movement was very strong, they began a campaign of expulsion of T.U.E.L. members in Chicago, New York, and elsewhere. They backed this up by suppressing free speech in the Union and infesting it with professional gangsters. Asterisk to the Socialist Old Guard leaders, to Sigmund in person, therefore belongs the shame of having initiated into the United States the reactionary policy, which they copied from their parent Amsterdam International, of expelling workers from labor unions and their jobs because of their political opinions. An attempt was made to give a color of justification to such expulsions by the absurd charge that the T.U.E.L. was a dual union. In Chicago, during a large protest meeting in Carmen's auditorium against these outrageous expulsions, a notorious gunman suddenly appeared from the fire escape and fired 3 shots into the meeting in my direction. I being the speaker, a disastrous panic was narrowly averted. We protested to Debs against this outrage and against the whole I.L.G.W. expulsion policy. Debs claimed he could do nothing about it, and he refused to take up the battle against the reactionary S.P. Old Guard. Instead, he later withdrew from the T.U.E.L. and criticized it openly. Thus Debs again exhibited his most serious political weakness, which was that throughout his career he consistently refused to join firmly with the left wing in its fights against the right-wing socialists, as exemplified by his stand in the 1909, 191s, 1919 C. Inner S.P. struggles, and now again in this 1923 fight. The reason for this ruthless attack was that the socialist leaders were extremely antagonistic to us because of the worldwide fight between socialists and communists, and they were also allied tightly with the Gompers bureaucracy and following out its whole class collaboration policy. The Gompers clique were quick to follow the lead given by the old guard socialist trade union leaders, and they proceeded to adopt the expulsion policy generally. They were determined to exterminate all rank and file opposition to their ruinous collaboration policies. They dramatized the expulsion policy at the Portland, 1923, A.F. of L Convention, where with bell, book, and candle, they demonstratively expelled from the convention William F. Dunn, T.U.E.L., National Committee member and regularly elected delegate of the Silver Bow, Butte, Montana, Trades Council. The T.U.E.L. was officially branded as a dual union, and a call was issued for war against the communists in the unions. And although the majority of the organized workers have voted for amalgamation, a Labor Party and Russian recognition, and the bulk of the organizations were definitely committed to one or all three of these issues. The reactionary leaders almost unanimously voted them all down, the Labour Party vote, for example, being 25,066 to 1,895. This most reactionary convention then capped its destructive work by adopting as Labour's constructive program the new schemes of class collaboration which were well nigh to destroy the unions during the next 6 years, but of all that more in the succeeding chapter. Read W.M. F. Dunn's speech Al the A. F. of L. Convention, T. U. E. L. Pamphlet. Never was there a more flagrant violation of trade union democracy than the actions of the Portland A. F. of L. Convention, one of the last attended by the arch-reactionary Gompers before his death. The misleaders of labor served notice that henceforth there would be war to the knife against the T. U. E. L. the communists and every sign of militancy in the labor movement, and there was. After Portland, expulsion from unions and jobs, backed by gangster control and suppression of trade union democracy, became the official weapon against the militant opposition. The A. F. of L. leaders demanded that the Cleveland, Minneapolis, Detroit, Seattle and other central labor unions expel all communists and T. U. E. L. members on pain of losing their charters. Then most of the international unions adopted the same policy, the socialist-controlled needle trade unions, as we shall see, outstripping all others in this reactionary campaign, wholesale expulsions in the needle industry even reaching the total of tens of thousands of workers in certain cases. Asterisk. Among the many militants expelled in this several years-long period of expulsions was myself. The usual expulsion method was to use little or no formality, but with me the following diplomacy was applied by the BRCA leaders. When, as usual, I submitted my dues by mail to Chicago to my local, I lived in New York, I was notified that upon instructions of the national office I should take a withdrawal card. I refused to do this, whereupon my dues in money was returned to me without explanation. I sent it back again, demanding dues stamps. No answer. Then, at the end of 3 months, I was notified that I had been dropped for non-payment of dues. Thus ended 16 years of membership in that union. In the early stages of the expulsion drive, the T. U. E. L. held its second national conference in Chicago, September 1, 1923, with 143 delegates from 90 cities, including 3 from Canada and 1 from Mexico. The convention took steps to speed up its 3 major campaigns, and worked out concrete plans for partial and complete amalgamation in the most important industries. It also proposed to fight the growing expulsions by mass demands for reinstatement in the unions. But it was unable to find effective means to consolidate its loose mass movements in the face of the developing offensive of the Gompers bureaucracy. Under pressure of the fierce attack of the top union leadership, in many cases supported by the bosses and the police, and under the influence of the growing prosperity and class collaboration, the T. U. E. L. forces in the unions were soon driven back. Hundreds of its best fighters lost their key union positions and also their jobs in the industries. Reaction and autocracy grew everywhere, and the movements for amalgamation, the Labor Party in recognition of Soviet Russia suffered a heavy decline. In this time also, the workers' militancy fell off greatly. Gradually, the work of the T. U. E. L. in general slowed down and lost in mass volume. Its militants found themselves largely cut off from the organized workers. Thus there entered the period of partial or relative isolation of the T. U. E. L. from the masses, a situation which was to last more or less as long as the Coolidge prosperity era. Chapter 13. The Trade Union, Educational League, Cant. D. The Coolidge prosperity period. Now let us examine somewhat more closely the extensive class collaboration movement in the trade unions during this period, and the war against the T. U. E. L. which was the reverse side of the dominant A. F. of L class collaboration policy. The era of the Coolidge, good times, which, including the few months of Hoover, lasted with but short breaks from the middle of 1923 until the October crash in 1929, was a period of difficult struggle and relative isolation from the masses for the T. U. E. L. It was a time of the least working-class militancy and struggle in the history of the American labor movement and of the worst corruption and autocratic rule ever practiced by the reactionary trade union leadership. Naturally, the T. U. E. L. felt sharply the effects of all the prosperity illusions, expulsions, terrorism, etc., in loss of mass contacts and mass movements. The basic cause of this great sag in labor struggle was the big upswing of American imperialism during this period. American capitalism made huge advances, economically and in international influence, the United States becoming the world's strongest imperialist power. Various factors combined to produce its great industrial development and, hence, its increased political power. Among them were the capital export of $20 billion war and post-war loans, which enormously stimulated American production and exports, the CA greater than 2 array of world markets from the crippled European POW. The introduction of a tremendous speed-up or rationalization of industry, the growth of the vast installment buying system, the industrialization and mechanization of agriculture, the expansion of the automobile and various luxury industries, the industrialization of the South, etc. Altogether, it was an orgy of profit-making for the American employers who became the objects of envy and admiration throughout the world capitalist class. During this period, the government was starkly reactionary. Its general spirit was exemplified by the huge growth of armaments and military propaganda, the repeated armed invasions of Caribbean and Central American countries, the systematic enslavement of Germany through the Dawes in Young plans, violent hostility towards the Soviet Union, and by such developments as hostile labor legislation, execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, continued imprisonment of Mooney and Billings, unchecked campaign of lynching in the South, the Teapot Dome scandal, the Scopes anti-evolution trial, etc. The rationalization of industry. In this era of wild profit-making and reaction, now looked back to by American capitalists as the Golden Age, the central aim of the employers was to further increase their swollen profits by the most intense speed-up of the workers. They vastly improved industrial technique, and to lure the workers into their speed-up trap they developed a whole series of tricky institutions, such as newfangled bonus and piecework plans, elaborate welfare systems, pseudo-old age pensions, employee stock buying, etc. All this was accomplished by oceans of slick propaganda, through every publicity channel of capitalism, to convince, while the company unions fitted into this general scheme, they were somewhat in abeyance during this period. They had been organized as a bar to the spread of trade unionism in the war period, and as the strength of the trade unions declined after the big defeat of 1919-22, so also did the company unions stagnate. It was only upon the new trade union upsurge in 1933 that the company unions took on a fresh lease of life. The workers that their interest resided in cooperating with the employers to increase production for minimum costs. This poison gas campaign took on wonderful aspects. The magic formula of mass production and high wages was all-legged to bring not only better living standards now, for the workers, but also their final emancipation from capitalism. A whole school of bourgeois economists developed this speed-up propaganda into a system which I at the time called capitalist efficiency socialism. For example, Carver argued how the workers with their high wages were gradually buying up control of industry. Gillette glibly stated that this was leading to a cooperative commonwealth. Chase portrayed the social wonders to be achieved by rationalizing capitalist industry. Foster and Catchings outlined their miraculous theory of financing the buyer, etc. Everything was lovely and the goose hung high. In short, there was no need for a proletarian revolution. American capitalism had cured its inner contradictions. No more industrial crises nor mass unemployment. Ford had superseded Marx, and the capitalists all over the world marveled at this wonder, lauded the American new capitalism and sought to introduce it in their own countries. The Communist, March 1928. T. National Bureau of Economic Research. I. Paul H. Douglas, Real Wages in the United States. In reality, however, the great volume of the new wealth created in these years by the rationalization of industry poured into the laps of the insatiable capitalists. The workers got very little of it. From 1923 to 1929, output in industry increased no less than 29% per worker, and profits doubled and tripled, but average real wages advanced, according to reliable figures, not more than 4%. Also most of this increase went only to the organized skilled workers, especially through overtime, steady work, etc., and their standards raised considerably. There was widespread in this period what Marx called the bourgeoisification of the labor aristocracy. The unskilled masses, if not materially much better off, were also considerably bourgeoisified ideologically from the current intense rationalization propaganda. It was a time of the most extensive capitalist prosperity illusions ever known among the toiling masses. The new orientation of the trade union bureaucracy. Without delay, the A.F. of L leadership fitted themselves into this entire capitalist speed-up rationalization program. In fact, they turned the unions into mere instruments of the capitalists' production plans. On the altar of production for less costs they sacrificed hard-won union conditions, and they peddled away every illusion put forth by the rationalization windjammers, besides inventing many of their own. Cheaper production became their fetish and the only way to working-class well-being. This whole development the T.U.E.L. dubbed the new orientation of the trade union bureaucracy towards intensified class collaboration, and the company unionization of the trade unions. It was the traditional A.F. of L class collaboration policy elaborated, theorized and revamped to meet the latest needs of the employers. The trade unions were reorganized on a basis of Fordism. As I have already indicated in the previous chapter, the movement began at the very outset of the Coolidge prosperity period, first taking shape on the railroads in the form of the so-called Baltimore and Ohio Plan. This plan was the means used to break finally the 1922 railroad shopmen's strike through a separate settlement with the B&O Railroad. The B&O Plan, officially known as Union Management Cooperation, was thus stated by William H. Johnston, president of the Machinists' Union. The idea underlying our service to the B&O may be compared to the idea which underlies the engineering services extended to the railroads by large supply corporations which have contracts with these railroads to furnish, let us say, superheaters, stokers, or lubricating oil. In his pamphlet, Class Struggle vs. Class Collaboration, Earl R. Browder, editor of the Labor Herald, stated the T.U.E.L. analysis of the B&O Plan as follows. It is an agreement whereby the Union purchases recognition from the railroad management by supplying efficiency engineers who, with the authority of the Union behind them, speed up production, eliminate waste, reduce the cost of production and eliminate undesirable workers and Union working rules that hamper efficiency in profit-making. F. The B&O Plan made a big hit with the A.F. of L. bureaucrats who went for it horse, foot and dragoons. The reactionary Portland, 1923, Convention endorsed it and accepted its principles as the central policy of the A.F. of L. in the U.S. and Canada, and immediately they began to spin wonderful speculations about the blessings that were to come from the new system. Soon this theorizing by Stone, Wall, Frey, Green, etc., produced the notorious New Wage policy of the A.F. of L. and the higher strategy of labor. These high-sounding terms were simply fancy names for surrendering the trade unions entirely to the greedy exploitation of the capitalists in return for the right of the bureaucrats to collect dues from the workers. The workers had but to work faster and faster and then, by some hocus-pocus, which the A.F. of L leaders never explained, they would, automatically and without struggle, get higher wages and steady work. Industrial crises and unemployment would be things of the past. Strikes were to be no longer necessary. At best, strikes were only remnants of the dark ages of the labor, quoted by D. M. Schneider, The Workers' Communist Party in American Trade Unions, page 11. T of the various T.U.E.L. publications during this period I contributed the book, Misleaders of Labor and the pamphlets, Wrecking the Labor, Banks, Strike Strategy, Organize the Unorganized, the Watson-Parker Law, as well as several statements of T.U.E.L. general program in pamphlet form. These deal in detail with the prevalent speed-up, class collaboration movement. There was no further need for the unions to perform their basic role as fighting organization. They were distorted into production instruments of the employers. The old class struggle was liquidated. Now the key to working-class prosperity was industrial cooperation with the employers. It was the two chickens in every pot philosophy of Hoover with a labor dressing. As the Coolidge period advanced, the class collaboration movement extended and deepened. On the basis of this reactionary speed-up program, many trade unions hired efficiency engineers, and their leaders went begging to the captains of industry to allow them to help in more ruthlessly exploiting the workers in return for union recognition. The new A.F. of L. President, William Green, actually pleaded that the trade unions, with their new wage policy, would be far more advantageous to them than the outmoded company unions. It was a case of the trade unions outstripping in servility the company unions themselves. Many employers, especially on the railroads, hearkened to this servile plea and made cooperative agreements, though the bulk of trustified industry, satisfied with its own system of efficiency engineers and unorganized workers, did not. The effects of the A.F. of L class collaboration agitation, however, ran far beyond the confines of the organized workers and poisoned sections of the unorganized as well. In his Industry Comes of Age, Tugwell lists the A.F. of L policy as one of the major causes for the huge increase of industrial efficiency in the Coolidge years. Fundamentally necessary to the success of the A.F. of L. new wage policy of class collaboration was the ruthless suppression of all militant opposition in the trade unions. Those workers who would not accept the speed-up were to be driven into it. It was no accident that the same A.F. of L. Portland, 1923, convention that endorsed the B&O Plan also launched the big offensive and expulsion campaign against the C.P.T.U.E.L. and their policies of class struggle, pulsions, gangster control, stealing of elections, packing of conventions, etc., became the rule throughout the broad A.F. of L. Trade union democracy sank to the lowest level in all labor history, while the trade union leaders cemented more and more firmly their alliances with the American Legion, Chambers of Commerce, Republican and Democratic parties and other capitalist organizations. Progressives and socialists support class collaboration. The progressives at once fell into step with the new class collaboration movement of the bosses and A.F. of L top leaders. In fact, they became its most skilled and enthusiastic leaders, and they were its instructors to the Gompers green bureaucracy. It was the progressives, Johnston and Bayer, who originated the B&O Plan. Johnston, Stone and Hillman were the outstanding champions of the corrupt and demoralizing labor banking movement, which I christened trade union capitalism, and which dovetailed into the whole class collaboration movement. And Stone and Hillman were among the chief theoreticians of the higher strategy of labor, Hillman thus stating this theory at the Philadelphia Convention of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. We have our problems, and fortunately it is not necessary to apply the weapon of the strike for the solution of many of them. We have passed in our industry from the days of the jungle into an era of civilized ways of dealing with employers. The socialists were equally ardent supporters of the B&O Plan, labor banking and the class collaboration movement generally. Many of them hailed it as the road to socialism. Abe Cahan baldly repudiated Marx as outmoded, and the Socialist Party struck out all reference to the class struggle from its membership application forms. Its attack against the Soviet Union was redoubled. Internationally, the social ISDS were no less enthusiastic about the class collaboration developments. The British Labour Party, the Germany Social Nationals joyfully hailed capitalist rationalization and the new capitalism. They spun many tricky theories about its developing into an organized capitalism, a super-imperialism, that was evolving directly into socialism. Ford became the messiah of the international socialist movement. The American socialist-led unions, mostly needle trades, became practically indistinguishable from ordinary A.F. of L unions. They practiced class collaboration intensely in all its newer forms. They were infested with gangsters. Democracy was practically unknown among them, and they pushed the expulsion campaign against the left wing to further limits than any other unions in the United States. Moreover, their leaders, dropping the last vestiges of the traditional socialist opposition, became part and parcel of the reactionary A.F. of L ruling clique. On this phase let witnesses friendly to them testify. After the World War, the socialist boring from within policies and tactics were completely reversed. Instead, they aimed to sue for the confidence and goodwill of the entrenched labor leaders. The new political alignment of the socialists with the administration forces marks the end of their leadership of the opposition in the labor movement. D. J. Sapis, Left-Wing Unionism, pp. 37-39. F. D. M. Schneider, The Workers' Communist Party and the American Trade Unions, page 21. The socialists gave up their policy of militant boring from within and sought to win the confidence of the A.F. of L administration. Demoralization and decay. Of course, the new capitalism was only the old capitalism in a fresh guise. The boasted rationalization of industry could not and did not cure the great inner contradiction of the capitalist system, the conflict between the rapidly increasing producing power of the toilers and their lagging purchasing power, which is the basic cause of the recurrent industrial crises. Sifted this fatal contradiction, the huge development of the productive forces during that period greatly hastening the whole system forward to the devastating international crash of 1929. Even a glance at the pages of Marx would have exposed this inevitable outcome. The whole rationalization business was a classical example of the suicide economics of capitalism. The much advertised paradise for the workers never materialized. During the Coolidge period, as we have already remarked, the workers as a class got very little out of the vastly increased wealth that they produced, and their very efficiency was rushing them on to the later holocaust of unemployment and mass starvation. What the workers did get in the Coolidge period, however, was the gravest demoralization, both ideological and organizational. Confused by the bourgeoisification of their upper ranks of skilled workers, they lost much of their fighting spirit. Never in the history of the labor movement were strikes so few and trade union morale so low. For the first time in their entire existence, the trade unions failed to grow during a period of prosperity. On the contrary, they actually lost members. With a relatively good demand for labor power, it should have been an easy matter to organize large numbers of workers. But the unions had all the vitality sucked and beaten out of them by the rationalization campaign, with its accompaniments of speed up, no strikes, surrender of union conditions, suppression of democracy, gangster control, expulsion of militants and capitalist prosperity propaganda. The Socialist Party, saturated with class collaboration, dwindled away in influence and membership until in 1927 it had no more than 7,425 members. The Farmer Labor Party movement also practically disappeared, except in Min. A.F. of L reports show the membership figures practically stationary from 1923 to 1929. But these statistics are illusory because during this time, many unions, notably the U, M, W, A, lost heavily in members but kept up their per capita tax in order to maintain their voting strength in A, F, of L, conventions. Minnesota, where it had become an established party. The I, W, W and such independent unions as the Amalgamated Food Workers, all of which had become penetrated with Coolidge prosperity illusions and lost their former militancy, declined heavily in membership and influence. The Coolidge era was the period of the deepest confusion and demoralization in the history of the American working class. The class collaboration poison was eating the very heart out of the labor movement. And upon this scene of working class paralysis the capitalists and their hangers-on could and did look with smug satisfaction. Thoughts of industrial crisis and strikes, not to speak of revolution, were far from their minds where America was concerned. They were drunk with power and prosperity. Their great enemy, the proletariat, seemed to be hopelessly drugged into insensibility and bound hand and foot by its official leaders. But they are living in a fool's paradise, as the next few years showed. The struggle of the T, U, E, L, internationally, the Comintern carried on a resolute struggle against these new forms of social reformism, against these disastrous policies which finally culminated in the German Socialist Leader's capitulation to fascism, and the Communist Party and the T, U, E, L, were the only labor organizations in the United States that understood and fought against the illusions and fallacies of the capitalist rationalization movement. They showed the futility of trying to solve capitalism's contradictions in any such way, and they warned of the inevitable industrial collapse. They resolutely combated every phase of the class collaboration movement and all its advocates, from Carver and Greene to Thomas and Must. They spared no effort to mobilize the workers for a policy of class struggle. In the Coolidge period the C, P, and T, U, E, L, under the leadership of the C, I, and R, I, L, U, gave a real demonstration of their revolutionary character. But the T, U, E, L, could not entirely escape the wave of pessimism and inaction that affected the working class. The combined effects of the bourgeoisification of the skilled workers, the poison propaganda of class collaboration, the turn of the progressives to the right and our split with them, and the barbarous expulsion policy and gangster control of the unions, definitely weakened the T, U, E, L's offensive in support of its three great issues of amalgamation, the Labor Party, and recognition of Soviet Russia, and prevented it from passing from the agitation stage into concrete action and results. T, U, E, L. Work was forced to take on more of a local or partial character than its big sweeping movement of 1922-23. The T, U, E, L. unskillfully made worse its relative isolation from the masses in this period by identifying itself too closely with the Communist Party. It adopted practically the whole program of the party, and in many cases its groups consisted entirely of communists. It also merged its official organ, the Labor Herald, into the Workers' Monthly, which then became the joint journal of both the T, U, E, L, and the C, P. With the workers in their passive mood and in view of the situation generally in the trade unions, this sectarian policy tended further to shrink the T, U, E, L. from a broad mass opposition movement of workers of every political opinion to a mere revolutionary propaganda organization. Nevertheless, in the Coolidge period the T, U, E, L. did manage to conduct a number of broad united front struggles. One of the more important of these was in the Carpenters' Union led by M. Rosen and N. Kajar. This union's leadership, corrupt and autocratic, followed the usual policy of intensified class collaboration and backed it up by expelling many militants in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, etc., in some cases with police help. The T, U, E. More effective, however, was the T, U, E, L. fight in the Machinists' Union, led by A. Overgaard. William H. Johnston, the head of this union, was the first sponsor of the B and O plan, and the organization was saturated with the new forms of class collaboration. Big discontent existed among the rank and file at the bad union conditions. Johnston tried to quell this by expelling Overgaard and many other militants in Toledo, Chicago, etc. As a result of the T, U, E, L's fight against the B and O plan, expulsions, etc., the left wing at the Detroit, 1924, I. A. of M convention polled 44 votes against the administration's 107. In the ensuing 1925 union election, the T, U, E, L. made a united front with the Progressive Anderson Group against the expulsion and class collaboration policy of the union leaders. Even from the official election returns it was clear that the United Front slate had won, but the so-called progressive. Johnston, according to the prevailing Union officials' practice, did not let that detail worry him. He proceeded to steal the election, announcing the doctored returns as Johnston 18,021, Anderson 17,076. The T.U.E.L. in the Coolidge years, conducted many other struggles against class collaboration in the various internationals, locals and central labor bodies. But its main fights occurred in the mining, textile and needle industries. In these three industries special conditions prevailed. Firstly, foreshadowing the eventual general crisis of American industry, they were all greatly depressed from overproduction, with accompanying unemployment, low wages, and bad union conditions. And secondly, the workers in these industries were especially rich in fighting traditions, so they responded more readily to T.U.E.L. leadership. The T.U.E.L. in the mining industry. Throughout almost the entire Coolidge period, the coal industry was in depression. This, part of the world coal crises, was caused by overdevelopment during the war, a high state of competition, mechanization of the mines, use of oil, water power and other substitutes for coal, etc. Result: chronic mass unemployment and gradual worsening of wages and working conditions even several years before the 1929 general crisis. The miners' position was made worse because the Lewis administration of the U.M.W.A., which in those years followed a typical conservative course, proved to be unable to alleviate these evil conditions. Consequently, the miners were deeply discontented and much inclined to hearken to the T.U.E.L. program. From its outset, the T.U.E.L. had a strong following among the miners. As we have seen, it defeated Farrington's attempt in Illinois to disrupt the 1922 national strike. It also took a prominent part in the fight against the expulsion of Alex Howard, militant president of the Kansas miners, a fight in which Lewis was once defeated by a convention vote of 977 to 866. On June 2–3, 1923, in Pittsburgh, the T.U.E.L. miners met and formed the Progressive International Committee of the U.M.W.A., with 25 delegates present, including Howard. Tom Myerscough became its secretary. This conference adopted a program of nationalization of the mines, labor party, amalgamation, organize the unorganized, recognition of Soviet Russia, alliance between miners and railroaders, 6-hour day, national agreements only, against dual unionism, for democracy in the Union, etc. At this conference it was reported how the T.U.E.L. had prevented a split of 40,000 miners in the anthracite. Lewis replied to this conference by making membership in the C.P. or T.U.E.L. an expulsion offense and, in the next period, by systematically expelling hundreds of militants. The first big clash with the Lewis machine came in the Union elections of 1924. On the basis of its Pittsburgh program, the Progressive U.M.W.A. committee put up as its candidate for president, George Voisey of Illinois, a communist miner. Although he was but little known, vast masses of miners voted for him. The final official returns gave Lewis 136,000 and Voisey 66,000. We charged fraud and asserted that Voisey had actually been elected. Things went from bad to worse in the U.M.W.A. The coal crisis deepened, the bosses redoubled their attacks upon the workers on all fronts. The U.M.W.A. administration ruthlessly expelled militants throughout the organization. At that time Lewis himself was a prominent figure in the Republican Party and many of his organizers and district presidents were tied up with employers' associations and all kinds of conservative organizations. The Union was shot through with the prevailing ruinous Union management cooperation. Consequently, the Union crumbled and fell to pieces in many districts, including Middle Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Maryland, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Alabama, Canada, etc. In 1925, the powerful Pittsburgh Coal Company repudiated the Jacksonville Agreement, went open shop, and threw down the gauntlet of battle to the U.M.W.A. In this grave crisis the T.U.E.L. forces raised the slogan, "Save the Union." They demanded that there be a vigorous organization campaign started in the South and other unorganized districts and that the anthracite miners unite their forces with the bituminous miners for joint action in the life and death struggle ahead. The T.U.E.L. built up a broad united front with non-communists and created a national Save the Union Committee, with branches in many localities. During this campaign I spent 5 months on the road doing organizing work. In the Union elections ensuing, this committee put up a united front, Save the Union, elect Tion ticket, headed by John Brophy, former president of District 2. Lewis violently opposed this entire development with further expulsions, suppressions of union democracy, etc. When the election returns were issued, they gave Lewis 173 greater than 323 and Poundell Brophy 60,661. We protested these figures, claimed gross frauds in many districts, and asserted that during Brophy's of 100,000 votes and thereby of the election. The next U.M.W.A. convention, late in 1926, presented a sorry picture. The Jacksonville Agreement was about to expire, the Union faced a desperate struggle, and no real preparations had been made for it. Widespread discontent at Lewis leadership existed in the Union. But the T.U.E.L. United Front forces could accomplish nothing at the convention. Lewis had solid control, based chiefly on large numbers of officeholder delegates from the organized territory. The left progressives also charged that there were hundreds of delegates from Blue Sky locals in the many disorganized districts where the district provisional administrations were appointed by the U.M.W.A. board. Lewis ruled the convention with a strong hand and defeated every proposal of the opposition. Evidently the U.M.W.A. was in very bad shape and threatened with disaster. On April 1, 1927, with the Jacksonville Agreement ended, the Union found itself on strike, or practically locked out, in all the unionized northern bituminous fields. The miners fought bravely and the C.P. and T.U.E.L. threw all the N forces into the desperate struggle. We organized mass picketing and set up a relief system under the leadership of A. Wagenknecht. As for the U.M.W.A. officialdom, it seemed paralyzed and disorganized. Characteristically also, the top A.F. of L leaders in Washington, lost in their dreams of prosperity through the speed-up and class collaboration, were oblivious of the vital importance of this most crucial strike and raised for the miners only enough funds to pay their strike relief rolls for 1 week. The organized left progressive bloc did much to stiffen the ranks of the miners, and so well did the strikers fight that on April 1, 1928, a full year after the strike began, they were still standing solid in all the key Union districts notwithstanding extreme starvation, neglect and police terrorism. On this date, the Save the Union movement held a national conference in Pittsburgh, sending approximately 100,000 miners from all over the country. The conference decided to strengthen the strike by stiff-ending up the picket lines and by extending the fight, first into the important western Pennsylvania and West Virginia fields, and finally into the anthracite districts. In consequence, a revival of picketing was had and 19,000 unorganized miners soon struck under T.U.E.L. leadership in nearby Fayette and Westmoreland counties. But the Great Strike was already defeated and we could not revive it. The formal end came when the Union signed a separate agreement in Illinois, and the miners who could get jobs draggled back to work in the other districts. The big battle was lost. The U.M.W.A. had been practically wiped out of its remaining strongholds in western Pennsylvania, northern West Virginia and Ohio. The vast bulk of the soft coal fields were now open shop. At one blow the miners lost wages and conditions in the Union that had taken 30 years to build up. The U.M.W.A. ceased to be a real power in the bituminous districts, and by this fact organized labor in general suffered one of the greatest defeats in its history. To our next chapter let us postpone the recital of left-wing developments in the coal industry after this disastrous strike. The T.U.E.L. in the textile industry. The textile industry, like coal mining, was in a state of depression from overproduction for several years before the 1929 crisis. Again, like mining, its bad situation was a part of a worldwide crisis in that industry. Unemployment, low wages, and excessive speed-up were the lot of the oppressed and impoverished textile workers. Only about 5% of the 1 million textile workers were organized, and these solely in the North, the South being totally unorganized. The principal unions were the United Textile Workers, the American Federation of Textile Operatives and the Associated Silk Workers, the two latter being independent unions. The leadership of these unions was saturated through and through with the current speed-up, class collaboration schemes, and worked diligently with the employers to intensify the exploitation of the workers. The three unions were inert and paralyzed, valuable only to the employers to help drive the workers faster and faster in production. Among the textile workers, who have good fighting traditions, there was much unrest, and the T.U.E.L. had worked among them since 1922. Its general program condemned B&O planism and company unionism, and called for a fighting policy, for honest leadership, amalgamation, and organization of the unorganized. It proposed a united front between the squabbling unions pending amalgamation. It organized local groups in the unions and set up united front mill committees in the mills, made up of representatives of the various unions and the unorganized. The TUEL textile section held 2 national and several local conferences. It did much local organization work and exposed the fallacies of class collaboration at all times. The first big TUEL mass movement among the textile workers was the Passaic, New Jersey, strike of 1926. The TUEL, under the name of the United Front Committee of Textile Workers, began activity in Passaic right after the 10% wage cut of October 1925. The UTW and the other textile unions were practically non-existent in Passaic, so the UFC began recruiting members and forming a union, and tending later to join the AFL. Soon 1,000 had affiliated, and on January 25, the UFC committee presented demands to the botany mill to rescind the wage cut, for time and 1/2 for overtime time and no discrimination against union workers. The company replied by discharging the whole committee of 45. Then the 5,000 botany workers struck and spread the fight to the other mills, soon involving 15,280 workers and tying up the whole Passaic textile industry. The strike was stubbornly fought on both sides. It lasted for 11 months. The bosses used the police, the courts, citizens' peace committees and every method of strikebreaking and terrorism. The workers replied with heroic solidarity and tireless endurance. One of the features of the strike was the big national relief campaign, into which the CP and TUEL threw all their effort. The official leader of the strike was A. Weisbord, a good mass speaker but a mediocre strategist, the real leadership of the strike resting in the core of revolutionaries, nearly all communists, actively participating in the top committees, including such fighters as W. Weinstone, Bill Dunn, E. G. Flynn, G. Deek, J. Balam, A. Wagenknecht, L. Cherenko, M. Siskind, etc. This very militant and dramatic strike of the impoverished textile workers attracted broad working-class sympathy all over the country, while the AFL officialdom, saturated with class collaboration poison, viewed it with ill-disguised hostility. Senators, governors, mayors, lawyers, philanthropists, etc., galore, took a hand in trying to settle the bitter struggle. By terrorism and duplicity the bosses were unable to break the strike, so, after 6 months of it, in July, they decided on a maneuver to defeat the workers. They announced that they would deal with the strikers provided the communist leadership was removed and the strikers were affiliated to the UTW. To agree to take out the mass leaders was a difficult condition for us, but the strike was in a hard situation. So, refusing to let the issue of communism stand in the way of a settlement, we called the bosses bluff and withdrew Weisbord, and we also affiliated the workers to the UTW. We were confident that with the other leaders above noted, the real heads of the strike, we could still hold firm leadership of the workers. For this whole course of action we were later severely criticized by the RILU. The employers, seeing that their maneuver had failed, then stated they would not deal with the AFL either. In consequence, the strike dragged on, bitterly fought, under our leadership, the UTW doing nothing, until December 13, when the big botany mills capitulated to the union by restoring the wage cut, agreeing not to discriminate against union members and recognizing grievance committees. The other mills soon followed suit. Thus ended almost a year of struggle. It was a hard-won, if only partial, victory, but it produced little tangible results in organization. The union, weakened by the long struggle and neglected by the UTW conservative McMahon leadership, was unable to follow up with a vigorous campaign for organization and against blacklisting. The Passaic strike was very important. It stood out like a lighthouse in the midst of the prevailing fog of class collaboration in the AFL. It was also the first mass strike in this country led independently by communists. Its strength ended the resistance of the textile workers all over the country and was a stimulant to the whole revolutionary movement. But, perhaps, most important of all was the influence this strike had, as we shall see, on changing the policy of revolutionary trade unionism in the United States. The TUEL in the needle trades. In the Coolidge, Prosperity years the needle industry, suffering like mining and textile from overdevelopment and extreme competition, experienced difficult and depressed conditions. Heavy unemployment became more and more chronic, and the busy seasons grew shorter and shorter. As in all industries, the employers drove through with a rationalization program, speeding the workers by every known device. The socialist top leaders of the unions in the industry dovetailed their policies to fit into this speed-up program of the bosses. In no other American industry was the class collaboration, union management cooperation, so highly developed as in the needle trades. The socialist leaders joined hands with the technicians of the employers in putting through a whole series of minimum standards of production, piece work systems, wage cuts, etc. Elected in their labor banks. No other unions went so far as they in the speed up, and none proceeded to such extremes to suppress the opposition by abolishing union democracy, by expulsions, blacklisting and gangster tactics. The needleworkers, the most revolutionary in American industry, revolted in large masses against the worsening of their unions and conditions through this misleadership. They accepted the T.U.E.L. and built its needle trade section into a powerful united front movement, with at one time at least 100,000 workers directly following its lead and many more under its influence. This mass revolt developed in all sections, especially in New York, the main center of the industry. The chief points in T.U.E.L. policy were, against class collaboration and for a policy of class struggle, against gangsterism and corruption and for union democracy, for amalgamation of all needle unions into one industrial union based on the shop delegate system, for the Labor Party, recognition of Soviet Russia, affiliation to the R.I.L.U., release of political prisoners, etc. Besides these general demands, the T.U.E.L. groups had specific programs for each union in the industry. The bitter fight took on much the aspect of a political struggle between the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. On the one side were the C.P. and T.U.E.L., backed by huge masses of discontented workers, aid on the other, the S.P. and union bureaucracies, supported chiefly by skilled workers and actively aided by the bosses, the A.F. of L., the capitalist newspapers, Tammany Hall politicians, and often even by the police. Never in any American unions had there been such a widespread and relentless internal fight. The struggle reached its most acute stages in the International Fur Workers Union and the International Ladies' Garment Workers Union. In the Amalgamated Clothing Workers conditions were as bad as in the other unions, as its top officials were among the outstanding advocates of class collaboration in the whole country. The T.U.E.L. fought to put the Amalgamated on a class struggle basis, and it had many successes, but our movement, principally because of poor leadership, did not take on the sustained mass character that it did in the I.F.W.U. and I.L.G.W.U. in the Cloth, Hat, Cap and Millinery Workers International Union, the left wing, led by M. Caesar, M. Zeebel, etc., also developed a strong movement which was influential in the life of the union, but it was not able to win control of the organization or of its large strikes away from the class collaboration-led leadership. To give a detailed picture of the long and complicated struggle of the T.U.E.L. in the needle trades would run far beyond space limitations here. The student can find the main facts in Jack Hardy's book, The Clothing Workers. Here all I can do is to touch upon the high points of the struggle in the two unions where it was the keenest, the fur workers and the I.L.G.W.U. In the I.F.W.U., the Kaufman bureaucracy, reactionary and autocratic, early followed the I.L.G.W.U. method of breaking the opposition to the speed up by expelling militants out of the union, blacklisting them from the shops, and ruling the union by gangster methods. At the union meetings dissenters were slugged, Ben Gold and A. Gross, the T.U.E.L. fur workers' leaders, being dangerously stabbed. The T.U.E.L. was condemned as a dual organization and membership in it pronounced sufficient cause for expulsion. But the mass opposition movement grew, nevertheless, as official mismanagement forced the workers' conditions from bad to worse. The struggle culminated in the May 1925 elections, when the T.U.E.L. forces, setting up a united front with the Sorkin-Winnick Middle Group, won control of the Furriers New York Joint Board, the bulk of the whole International Union. Gold became head of the new local administration. In February 1926, over 12,000 New York furriers under Gold's leadership went on strike with a central demand for the 40-hour week. The ensuing 17-week struggle was won, International Publishers, 1935. Of the hardest fought in the history of New York. The workers not only had to battle large numbers of professional scabs and gangsters, but also the right-wing leaders of the International Union sabotaged the strike shamelessly. When it finally looked like victory in spite of all, these people brought in William Green, and together they made an agreement with the bosses behind the local leadership's back for a 42-hour week. Then they tried to stampede the strikers to return to the shops. But the workers stood firm, rejected Green's settlement, carried on their strike for several weeks longer, and finally won the 40-hour week. It was a slashing victory, a splendid example of effective strike leadership and a sharp repudiation of the whole A.F. of L no strike policy. The right-wing socialist labor leaders, and especially Green himself, were greatly compromised by these events. These people especially feared the stimulating effect of this splendid strike upon the discontented masses throughout the needle trades. So they redoubled their attacks upon the union's left-wing leaders. They shouted Red Revolution, charged Gold with mishandling the union's funds, using violence in the strike, bribing the police, violating the union constitution, etc. Then an A.F. of L. investigation committee, composed of the ultra-reactionaries M. Wall, E. McGrady, J. Ryan, J. Sullivan and Hugh Frayne, with the cooperation of the S.P., the bosses, newspapers, etc., proceeded to reorganize the New York Joint Board by expelling its members, dissolving its 4 locals, and setting up new unions. This action forced the great mass of furriers outside the A.F. of L., where they remained under left leadership and in the sharpest struggle until unity was achieved 7 years later. But about this phase of independent existence more will be said in succeeding chapters. The struggle in the I.L.G.W.U. was no less bitter and protracted. Again, only its bare outlines can be given here. In the I.L.G.W.U., the most outstanding left United Front leaders were Borakovich, Hyman, Wirtis, Zimmerman, Portnoy, etc. This union suffered acutely from the prevalent union management cooperation, schemes, gangsterism, suppression of democracy, etc. Especially vicious was the expel Scion policy. The T.U.E.L. forces fought in all garment centers against these conditions, but the fight climaxed in New York, where the masses gave the left-wing militants a ready ear. The first major clash came in 1925. After 3 years of struggle, the T.U.E.L. had built up a left United Front leadership in Locals 2, 9 and 22, comprising about 70% of the New York Joint Board, backbone of the International. Whereupon President Morris Sigmund on June 11, seizing upon the absurd pretext that the Communist Freiheit editor M. Ulgen had spoken at the Locals' May Day meeting, arbitrarily expelled the whole regularly elected 77 executive board members of the 3 locals as communists, which amounted to expelling some 35,000 members. This provoked an explosion of indignation in the industry. The Joint Action Committee was set up among the expelled locals, a bitter struggle ensued, and after 16 weeks of it, Sigmund had to give in and reinstate the expelled locals and executive boards. This was a big left-wing victory, and it mobilized at least 75% of the whole I.L.G.W.U.'s membership behind the T.U.E.L. militants. The left-wing United Front got control of the New York Joint Board and elected L. Hyman as manager. Similar victories were had in the Chicago Joint Board and in local unions in many centers. But the old guard, Socialist Sigmund administration managed to retain control at the Philadelphia, November 1925, convention of the Union by reason of the prevailing system of paper locales and disproportionate representation. Thus Sigmund had on his side 146 delegates representing 15,852 members, while the opposition, representing 34,762 members, had only 114 delegates. With the convention thus packed, Sigmund ruthlessly steamrollered the left-wing proposals. This provoked a crisis, and the outraged opposition delegates left the convention in a body, determined to launch a new union. It was only upon the advice of the T.U.E.L., represented by Bill Dunn, that, to preserve the union's unity, they returned to the hall. A few concessions were won, but Sigmund's destructive grip was not broken. The convention left much bitterness in the union. The next big struggle between the conservative administration and the T.U.E.L. United Front developed during the strike of 35,000 New York cloakmakers, beginning July 1, 1926, which was led by the left-wing New York Joint Board. Again, as in the Furriers' strike, the right-wing leadership sabotaged the struggle. And again, seizing a favorable time when the strikers were exhausted by the long fight, the Sigmund leadership, although they had regularly spoken for and endorsed the strike at its outset, suddenly on December 13, denounced it as illegal, took over the negotiations with the bosses, referred the whole matter to arbitration, and ordered the cloakmakers back to work. Unlike in the Furriers' strike, the lefts were unable to defeat this maneuver by mobilizing the strike-tired workers, so the strike was lost and the workers' conditions were slashed by the arbitration board. It was a big defeat for the workers and the T.U.E.L. Sigmund, with a F of L and S. P. support, then intensified his offensive against the T.U.E.L. by expelling the New York Joint Board and several of the big New York locals. Similar action was taken in Chicago and other left strongholds. Then, aided by the pressure of the bosses' blacklist, the I.L. G. W. U leaders proceeded with a campaign of re-registering expelled workers into new local unions. Like other reactionaries in similar situations, the I. L. G. W. U. leaders showed that they were ready to wreck the union rather than allow it to pass under left leadership. As the result of Sigmund's splitting policy, at least 35,000 workers now found themselves expelled from the I. L. G. W. U. Thus of the furriers and the I. L. G. W. U. Altogether some 50,000 workers had been ousted from their unions, and the A. F. of L. They, therefore, linked forces in a joint action committee to continue the struggle for trade union unity. Through reinstatement, for democratization of the A. F. of L. needle unions, and against the rapidly worsening economic conditions of the needle trades workers. But here let us leave them for a while and consider the general course of the T. U. E. L. of the revolutionary trade union movement as a whole. The trend towards independent unionism. Ever since 1912, the T. U. E. L. and its predecessor organizations, the S. L. of N. A. and the I. T. U. E. L. had carried on a stout fight against dual unionism, but now in the latter Coolidge period, 1926 to 29, forces were at work that were gradually pushing the T. U. E. L. towards a partial policy of independent unionism. Indeed, there had long been a potential base for such unionism in the great masses of deeply exploited, unorganized workers in the mass production, trustified industries which the A. F. of L. had been unable and unwilling to unionize. This was true, in spite of the fact that such dual organizations as the I. W. 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 I. U. etc., because of their ultra-revolutionary programs, hostility to A. F. of L workers, and general sectarian practices, were never able to build any independent unions on a permanent mass basis among the huge numbers of unorganized. The general course of events in the post-war Coolidge years had tended to greatly strengthen this potential basis for independent unionism and finally to put before the revolutionary movement as a living issue the question of forming new unions. Let us cite four of the general forces tending to produce this result, as follows. 1. There was the narrowing down of the A. F. of L base in many industries during the great post-war employers' offensive, including the complete wiping out of its unions by strikes in the steel, lumber and meatpacking industries, the crushing defeat of the railroad unions in 1922 with a loss of several 100,000 members, and the eventual breaking down of the U. M. W. A. in the bituminous fields, B. Sides, there was a serious weakening of the unions in various other industries, including building trades, marine transport, printing, needle, textile, food, shoes, etc. In consequence of these strike defeats, the worst in our labor history, the numerical strength and strategical position of the A. F. of L. had been greatly weakened and the percentage of unorganized EED workers much increased. Especially the A. F. of L. had lost great masses of unskilled workers and tended to become more and more an organization of the skilled labor aristocracy. 2. There was the adoption by the A. F. of L. of its no-strike, union management cooperation, higher strategy of labor program. This policy of class collaboration, by distorting the unions from their basic role as fighting organizations into adjuncts of the employer's production speed-up, killed the militant spirit of the unions and inflicted upon the labor movement a disastrous dry rot. As a result of it, the unions, during the Coolidge, prosperity, years, were not only not able to recover their losses in the big post-war strikes, but as we have seen, for the first time in history, had steadily declined in strength and influence. The A. F. of L. became less able than ever to defend its own members' interests and to organize the unorganized. 3. There was the expulsion of large numbers of militant and revolutionary workers from the trade unions, a fact which robbed these organizations of their best elements and hastened their decline. In consequence of these expulsions, the T. U. E. L. militants, largely outside, found it very difficult to work within the A. F. of L unions, which, to make matters worse, were gangster-ridden and bereft of democracy. 4. There was a new and growing tendency among the organized and unorganized masses to fight, exemplified by such bitter, hard-fought strikes as the Passaic textile workers, the New York fur and cloak makers in 1926, the National U. M. W. A. strike of 1927, the Boston shoe workers' strike, the New Bedford textile strike, and the great 1929 strike of textile workers in Gastonia, Elizabethton and many southern towns. This developing strike movement could not be stimulated, developed and led to victory by the corrupted leaders of the half-dead A. F. of L unions, with their no-strike policies, but was in every instance directly sabotaged by them. All these factors combined showed a definite decline of the F. of L unions in strength and fighting ability. Their heavy loss of members and spirit-killing class collaboration, the mass expulsions, and the growing urge for organization among the unorganized, all work together to prepare the ground for independent unionism. Especially in the three major fields of T, U, E, L. Activity, mining, textile, needle, the basis for new unions was definite and strong. In the mining industry, the bituminous section of the U, M, W, A had been wrecked. The militants stood expelled in great numbers, and the miners, with long organization experience, were bitter against the U, M, W, A, and definitely disposed to form a new union. After the disastrous 1927 strike, this tendency manifested itself by the growth of a whole series of spontaneous local dual organizations in Canada. Colorado, I, W, W. West Virginia, Keeney, Illinois, P, M, A. 1932, Oklahoma, the Anthracite districts, etc. A general outcropping of new unions was taking the place of the collapsing U, M, W, A. In the textile industry, the tendency towards independent unionism took a somewhat different course, but the general direction was the same. The U, T, W and the other textile unions, containing only 5% of the workers, were paralyzed by the intense class collaboration practices of the period and were both unable and unwilling to respond to the demands of the discontented workers in the industry for a fight in behalf of their demands. The result we have seen in Passaic, where the T, U, E, L, in spite of its intense anti-dual union attitude, was compelled to form an independent union in order to organize the workers. In the needle trades, the course towards independent unionism was again somewhat different, but nonetheless sure. The reactionary course of the union leadership, the steadily worsening economic conditions, the expulsion of almost 50,000 militant workers, all created a growing mass demand in the industry for a new, fighting industrial union. But the T, U, E, L, traditional fighter against dual unionism, strongly resisted these mass demands for new unions. In the mining industry, for example, at the big April 1, 1928, Save the Union Pittsburgh Conference, representing 100,000 miners, there was a strong trend to launch a new union, but it was defeated by the T, U, E, L, and C, P, opposition. Most of the above-mentioned new unions in the mining industry were initiated by socialists and other non-communists. In the textile industry in Passaic, even after the T, U, E, L, had been compelled to form a new union, we were opposed to its independent existence and proceeded to affiliate it to the torpid U, T, W. This, indeed, being our line in all industries where we built new unions among the unorganized. And in the needle trades it was the T, U, E, L, that was responsible for stopping the split at the Philadelphia Convention of the I, L, G, W, U and for generally having the masses of expelled workers adopt the policy of fighting for reinstatement in their old organizations. Just in the midst of these developments, on December 3–4, 1927, the T, U, E, L, held its third national conference in New York, whither the organization had just removed its headquarters from Chicago. There were 297 delegates, of whom 107 were from the needle trades. In total they represented a following estimated at 300,000, or about 10% of the trade union movement. The conference clearly realized the menace arising from the smashing of the A, F, of L in many industries, its failure to organize the unorganized, its fatal no-strike, class collaboration policy and its reactionary trend in general. It stated that the unions were in full retreat before the employers' economic, political and ideological offensive and declared that the very existence of the trade unions was endangered. But it did not understand these developments as laying the basis for independent unionism. On the contrary, the whole orientation of the T, U, E, L, Third Conference was towards the A, F, of L. It directed all its efforts to an intensification of the fight within the old unions against class collaboration, for trade union democracy, for the organization of the unorganized, for the Labor Party, for unemployment insurance, against trade union capitalism, labor banking, against racial discrimination, for world trade union unity, etc. It called upon the many expelled workers to fight for reinstatement into their former unions, and it put forth as a central slogan, "Save the trade unions." The R, I, L, U, takes a hand. At this juncture the R, I, L, U had a very important word to say on the American situation. Its Fourth World Congress, held beginning March 17, 1928, adopted a resolution, with the full concurrence of the T, U, E, L, delegation, developing the need for the building of new unions in the United States. The resolution stated, the vital and immediate task of the T, U, E, L, is to become the leading organization struggling to organize the unorganized, concentrating especially in mining, steel, oil, automobiles, rubber, textile, chemicals, marine, transport and lumber industries. The TUEL, when necessary, may fight for the affiliation of the organizations of the AFL, but only on conditions which guarantee class leadership and a militant program. The resolution, while making the organization of the unorganized the central TUEL task, also stressed the necessity of developing the work in the AFL, thus. At the same time it must use all the possibilities of working inside the existing unions and fighting for the leadership of the workers organized in them. This resolution was accompanied, on March 15, 1928, by an article of A. Lasovsky, General Secretary of the RILU, in the Communist International, sharply criticizing the policy of the TUEL, and pronouncing it one of dancing quadrilles around the AFL. Lasovsky pointed out in Report of the 4th RJLU Congress, page 136. English edition. 214 from Byran to Stalin. This article, the narrowing base of the AFL and the growing field for independent unionism. He declared that the TUEL, by relying on the AFL leaders, by trade union legalism, and by making a fetish of anti-dual unionism, was neglecting the organization of the unorganized. Especially did he put great stress upon the recent IWW strike of Colorado miners and our own Passaic strike as indicators of the need for new unions. He drastically condemned our policy in Passaic of turning our new union over to the reactionary UTW. Out of all this he drew the conclusion that the TUEL must develop more of an independent leadership, and that while the work in the AFL unions must be continued and developed, the TUEL should give vastly more attention to the actual organization of the unorganized into new industrial unions in industries where the old unions did not exist or could not function. Lasovsky's main point was well taken. The TUEL, for years past, should have paid more attention to directly organizing the unorganized in the basic, mass production industries, and this would have implied launching, temporarily at least, independent unions in many cases where the AFL unions did not function. It is true that, in principle, the TUEL had long endorsed the policy of supporting new unions where the AFL was decrepit or defunct, or where the independents took on a mass character. It was on this basis that the TUEL backed the amalgamated clothing workers, the amalgamated food workers, the railroad brotherhoods and the IWW in agriculture, while at the same time it urged the affiliation of these organizations to the AFL. In point of fact, however, the TUEL, in its deep-seated and profoundly correct antagonism to dual unionism, had leaned somewhat backward in handling this question and had undoubtedly neglected unorganized fields where independent unions might have been built. The Fourth Congress resolution and Lasovsky's blast caused a great commotion in the Communist Party and the TUEL. A burning discussion started at once. This reached a head in the May 1928 meeting of the C.P. Central Committee, which, while unanimously concurring in the main with Lasovsky's general proposals and agreeing with the need for independent unions in industries where the AFL did not function, sharply warned against abandoning work in the old organizations. The combined trade unions still have a membership of approximately 3 million. These we cannot surrender to the leadership of the reactionary bureaucrats. We must continue and tend our work among these organizations, to build our party, and to capture the rank and file from control of the reactionaries. Our party has behind it the general left-wing tradition of 30 years of dual unionism. At best, it is difficult to work in reactionary American trade unions. Should there be the slightest minimizing of this work, inevitably there would be a tendency on the part of our comrades to neglect it and to desert the old unions. This can be counteracted only by clearly stating the necessity of communists working within the AFL unions and laying down programs for the work. This was a timely warning, and it turned out that the TUEL and C.P. would have done swell had they borne it clearly in mind during the next few years. But what was not so sound in our May resolution was its argumentation that the new stress upon independent unionism did not basically alter our existing policy towards new unions, but was only a matter of emphasis. The Communist, July 1928. At the time we had much factional division in the CP over this question. I was one of those who sharply warned of the danger of abandoning work in the old unions, a logical position in view of my many years' advocacy of boring from within. J. P. Cannon, who a year later became a counter-revolutionary Trotskyite and bitter enemy of the C. P. T. U. E. L. and independent unionism, at this time sharply criticized me for seeing a danger of dual unions, and he said my argument aimed to raise a scare about abandoning the work in the old unions where none exists. Chapter 14. The Trade Union Unity League. The T. U. E. L. began its reorientation in policy towards independent unionism during the middle of 1928 by the organization of new unions in the three industries where it had its most substantial forces: mining, textile and needle, and where, because of wholesale expulsions, decline of the A. F. of L unions, etc., conditions were ripest. The first of these unions to be set up was the National Miners Union at its convention in Pittsburgh, September 1928. The miners were badly disorganized after the loss of the great 1927-28 strike, and only some 15,000 joined the new organization. The second union established was the National Textile Workers Union, in New York, September 1928, with about 5,000 members. Then came the Needle Trades Workers Industrial Union, founded in a convention representing 22,000 workers in New York, January 1929. All these membership figures are only approximate, as the dues systems were as yet poorly organized. The T. U. E. L. held its fourth national conference, or, more properly, convention, in Cleveland, August 31 to September 1, 1929. There were present 690 delegates from 18 states, including 15 delegates from the Pacific Coast. Of these, 322 delegates came from the three new industrial unions, then comprising approximately, probably an excessive estimate, 57,000 members, 159 delegates from left-wing groups in trade unions, 107 from small groups in unorganized industries, 18 directly from A. F. of L locals with 2,855 members, 40 were members of the T. U. E. L. National Committee, and 44 fraternal, 64 were Negroes, 72 women and 159 youths. The average age of the delegates was only 32 years. The convention reorganized the T. U. E. L. and changed its name to the Trade Union Unity League. This was in conformity with the new tendencies in our movement, which were enthusiastically supported by the big convention delegation. The new constitution provided for three types of national organization: A. Industrial unions, B. Industrial leagues, and C. Trade union minority groups. A. The national industrial unions, adapted in form to the conditions in each industry, were based upon the principles of one shop, one industry, one union. They were departmentalized, corresponding to the important subdivisions of their industries. They had autonomy to elect their own officials, set their dues rates and initiation fees, work out their detailed programs and union agreements, and conduct their own strikes, subject only to General T. U. L. control. An important feature was their youth sections. B. The national industrial leagues were industrial unions in embryo. They were loose national groupings of local unions, shop committees, and individual workers. Bodies not yet strong enough to function as unions, their dues were set and their general activities supervised by the T. U. L. National Executive Board. C. The national trade union minority groups were a continuation of the old T. U. E. L. National industrial sections working within the conservative unions. Where A. F. of L and T. U. L. unions existed in one industry, the T. U. L. union was connected up with the T. U. L. minority in the A. F. of L to secure joint action. Locally, the T. U. L. assumed a variety of forms, including local industrial unions, local craft unions, shop committees, initiative organizing groups, and left-wing trade union groups. All these were linked together into city-wide trade union unity councils. There was also provision for state trade union unity councils, although none ever developed. Nationally, the T. U. L. was headed by a national committee of 53 members, elected at the National Convent. Tion. The N.C., to meet every 6 months, elected the National Executive Board of 10 members, to meet monthly. The National Convention elected the following national officers of the T. U. L. General Secretary, William Z. Foster. Assistant Secretary and Treasurer, John Schmies. National Organizer, J. W. Johnston. National Negro Organizer, J. W. Ford. Editor, W. F. Dunn. Asterisk with but small modifications, this general system of organization, national and local, prevailed throughout the life of the T. U. L. The official T. U. L. Organ was labor unity, and each national union and league had its own journal or bulletin. The program of the T.U.U.L. The Cleveland Convention organized the T.U.U.L. into a new trade union center. But the convention did not set up a general system of dual unionism. It declared against a policy of individual withdrawals or petty splits from the A.F. of L, and it proposed to form new unions only where the A.F. of L unions were decrepit or non-existent. It also warned repeatedly against slackening the work inside the A.F. of L. The program said, the new Trade Union Unity League has as its main task the organization of the unorganized into industrial unions independent of the A.F. of L. At the same time, it organizes the revolutionary workers with the reformist unions. It unites politically and organizationally the unemployed with the employed. Except for these important new union developments, the convention continued and developed the general policies of the old T.U.E.L. It was distinctly a left convention. There were present but few outstanding trade union progressives. This was not remarkable, because at this time, the highest point of the Coolidge boom, the progressives were quite generally very enthused over trying to save the working class by the A.F. of L union management cooperation. Later editors of Labor Unity were N. Honig and Pat Toohey. B. and O plan, method of speeding up production, and they rejected the T.U.U.L. line of militant class struggle as naive and outmoded. The convention made a head-on collision against the whole A.F. of L employer schemes of intensified class collaboration, B and O plan, higher strategy of labor, new wage policy, labor banking, etc. The heart of the convention was the struggle against capitalist rationalization and all its evil consequences of speed-up, unemployment, accidents, occupational sickness, low wages, etc. The convention declared for a militant strike policy. Its program was based on the class struggle, and its central slogan was, class against class. The convention's main decisions were sloganized as follows. Build the Trade Union Unity League, fight against imperialist war, defend the Soviet Union, fight against capitalist rationalization, organize the unorganized, for the 7-hour day, 5-day week, for social insurance, for full racial, social and political equality for Negroes, organize the youth and the women, defeat the misleaders of labor, for world trade union unity. The convention paid much attention to questions of industrial unionism, strike strategy, and the organization of the unorganized. It directed T.U.U.L. attention more sharply to the basic unorganized industries, steel, automobile, chemicals, agriculture, etc., and to work in the South. It discussed at length the problems of building shop committees in the mass production, trustified industries, and how to defeat the boss's spy and blacklist systems. It worked out the application of the United Front, especially between employed and unemployed, and between the A.F. of L rank and file and the members of the T.U.U.L. unions. It stressed the policy of independent leadership by the workers, as against their reactionary union officials. The Convention also paid much attention to the special problems of Negro, youth and women workers, questions which had been largely neglected in the early days of the T.U.U.L. Labor Unity, September 14, 1929. It declared its solidarity with the oppressed workers in the colonial and semi-colonial countries. It warned of the danger of imperialist war, especially war against the Soviet Union. With no illusions as to the extent or continuance of the prevailing prosperity, the convention adopted a demand for federal social insurance, based on full wages for all workers incapacitated through unemployment, sickness, accident, or old age. The convention also modified the former T.U.E.L. attitude towards the Labor Party. In view of the prevailing reaction in union official circles, it declared for participation in the Labor Party only where it was actually a party in the hands of the workers. In the 1932 elections, the T.U.U.L. and its unions supported the Communist Party ticket, as the T.U.E.L. had done in 1924-28. The A.F. of L and the economic crisis. Less than 2 months after the T.U.U.L. convention, the great 1929 world industrial crash took place. The dizzy financial structure of American capitalism collapsed. The intense rationalization of industry and agriculture that was to herald in the dawn of universal prosperity had resulted in a huge market glut, a great overproduction which the impoverished and robbed masses could not buy back and which could not be disposed of abroad. Industry swiftly fell off about 1/2 and wages were slashed on all sides. Agricultural prices dropped about 60% and land values declined accordingly. The army of unemployed leapt from the 3 million of the so-called good times to the unheard of total of 17 million in 1933. A monstrous development of poverty, destitution and starvation enveloped the toiling masses all over the country. Fear of revolution seized upon the ruling class. The boasted, new capitalism, was giving a graphic illustration of the fact that it was only the old capitalism after all and that, as such, it was hopelessly involved in the worldwide decay and decline of the capitalist system. Asterisk. In my book Towards Soviet America, written in 1932, I have made an analysis of the basic causes, course and probable results of the crisis. The onset of the terrific crisis created consternation among the trade union and socialist party leaders. Tumbled in ruins overnight were their glittering dreams of the new wage policy, the higher strategy of labor, organized capitalism, and all the rest of their speed-up, class collaboration, prosperity fantasies. The labor movement under their leadership had been demoralized and confused and the workers poisoned and disorganized by the long-continued class collaboration, no strike, B&O plan propaganda. The unions were weakened by loss of members, suppression of democracy and the expulsion of their best fighters. Hence, as a result of these destructive policies, when the test came under the shattering blows of the crisis, naturally the masses were quite unprepared to defend themselves and their official leaders knew no other policy than one of precipitate retreat. Consequently, during the first 3.5 years of the crisis, until Roosevelt's New Deal, the great mass of the workers did not develop any real resistance, while the employers brutally shoved the burden of the crisis upon them and their families by mercilessly slashing their wages and reducing living standards generally. And the trade union leaders actually helped the employers in this savage attack by their surrender policies. Through this period of wholesale slaughter of the workers' conditions there were fewer strikes than for many years previously. In 1930, for example, there were only 1/10 as many strikers as in the corresponding crisis years of 1922. The situation in Chicago was typical of that prevailing throughout the entire United States. Despite that the workers of that city had many militant traditions and strong labor unions and fully 50% of industrial workers were thrown out of work and the rest had their wages cut from 20% to 5% greater than yet there was not a single strike of any importance whatever in the first 3 years of the crisis. Unrestrainedly, the capitalists gloated over the widespread working-class demoralization, the logical result of long years of F.L. policy. Their publicists hypocritically declared that it indicated a great harmony between capital and labor, and they slobbered over the workers' patience and loyalty in facing the trials of the crisis. The capitalists, in their need, were indeed making effective use of their labor lieutenants, the craft union leaders. This period was one of the most shameful in the whole wretched history of the A.F.L. policy. Every major step of the employers to save themselves at the workers' expense actually had the A.F.L. leaders' direct or indirect support. These misleaders lulled the workers' vigilance by repeating all of the capitalists' underestimation of the crisis and ballyhoo about prosperity being just around the corner. Hardly had the crisis begun when President Hoover, on November 1929, called a National Industrial Conference of Employers and Trade Union Leaders, presumably to maintain wage standards. At that time wages were already being slashed in the unorganized mass production industries, and the purpose of the Hoover Conference was manifestly to hog-tie the trade unions by a no-wage cut no-strike illusory agreement until, the masses of unorganized having their wages cut, it would be relatively easy also to reduce the rates of the trade union workers. Instead of adopting a militant strike resistance against the developing wave of wage cuts at the very start of the crisis, as the T.U.L. urged, Green and the other A.F.L. leaders served as bellwethers to draw the masses into Hoover's trap. Thus, by their Hoover Agreement, the A.F.L. leaders threw the unorganized workers at once to the wage-cutting wolves. The wage slashing went ahead full blast in the trusteefied industries, the betrayed and demoralized workers being unable to resist, and meanwhile both Hoover and Green brazenly asserted that there had been no wage reductions. Finally, when the unorganized workers were deflated, inevitably it came the turn of the organized workers to be slashed. Whereupon, the trade union leaders, reflecting the capitalists' interests, became ardent wage cutters themselves, actually arguing that since wage cuts had gone into effect in the unorganized industries, now the organized workers had to accept reductions. So union after union accepted one cut upon another without the slightest resistance. What wage cutters the leaders became was well illustrated when Matthew Wall hailed the acceptance of a 10% wage reduction by the railroad unions without a strike as one of the greatest industrial achievements in the history of the country. In the needle trades the socialist leaders also followed the general A.F.L. policy of retreat. Never before in an economic crisis had the American working class taken wage cuts lying down, as the great struggles of the 1890s and 1921-22 eloquently show. Because of this aid from their A.F. of L. Labor lieutenants, the capitalists were able to put through their huge wage-slashing campaign without serious working-class resistance, except what was developed by the weak L. unions, of which more later. But the betrayal of the workers' interests by the A.F. of L leadership reached its greatest depths in the case of the hungry millions of unemployed. Hoover's plan to handle the question of unemployment, and this was the plan of finance capital, was twofold. First, a policy or share the work, or share the poverty, which meant to force the great body of workers onto short time and correspondingly reduced wages, and second, a policy of treating unemployment relief as a matter of local charity and no concern of the federal government. It was a most brutal program of organized mass starvation. To their shame, it must be said that the A.F. of L leaders fitted themselves also into this outrageous assault upon working-class living standards. They became the greatest champions of Hoover's stagger plan of sharing work, and they were fanatical antagonists of unemployment insurance. With incredible brass and stupidity, they denounced the dole as subsidizing idleness, degrading to the dignity of the American working man, and a hindrance to real progress. They declared that unemployment insurance meant the ruin of the trade unions and the downfall of civilization. In short, they made all the current arguments of big capital against feeding the starving masses. For this reactionary stand, the A.F. of L won glowing praise from the Wall Street rulers of America. At the Boston, 1930, A.F. of L convention, Hoover, many generals, bishops, capital ISDS, American Legion officials, etc., joined with Greene, Wall, Frey and others in repudiating unemployment insurance and denouncing the communists who were so persistently fighting for it all over the country. And while the A.F. of L leaders thus basked in the praise of the enemies of the working class, millions of unemployed workers and their families were sinking deeper and deeper into destitution and actual starvation. The T.U.U.L. in the crisis. The onset of the industrial crisis came as no surprise to the Communist Party and the T.U.U.L. As Marxist-Leninist organizations, they had long understood the temporary character of the prosperity and foresaw its inevitable crash. While the trade union and socialist leaders were singing the praises of capitalist industrial rationalization in the Coolidge period, the C.P. and the old T.U.E.L. had been warning the workers of the bitter reckoning to come. And as the crisis developed, the T.U.U.L. and the C.P. undertook to mobilize the workers for struggle against the growing capitalist offensive against mass living standards. They conducted many strikes and developed a strong campaign for unemployment insurance and relief. Besides, they carried on many other militant activities, such as support of the struggling farmers, the Veterans Bonus Campaign, the student movement, the Mooney and Scottsboro cases, etc. It is an incontestable fact that during the crisis up to the New Deal period, the only serious resistance made by the workers and other toilers against the monstrous mass pauperization was that organized and led by the C.P. and T.U.U.L. The employers and the government countered this left-wing militancy with a policy of ruthless brutality. In most industries, known membership in the T.U.U.L. was a signal for certain discharge and blacklist. T.U.U.L. strikes were fought by the employers ferociously. T.U.U.L. strike committees were raided and their members jailed. Pickets were viciously slugged, shot, gassed and arrested. Innumerable injunctions were issued against the red unions by the courts. Asterisk in several states T.U.U.L. unions were declared illegal. In Brooklyn, agents of the Department of Labor intimidated employers and warned them not to make agreements with the T.U.U.L. organizations. And the same department, under the infamous labor trader Doak, deported hundreds of militant workers, including many T.U.U.L. union officials, often to fascist countries. Especially vicious were the government attacks upon the T.U.U.L. unemployed demonstrations, its answer being the club, the revolver, tear gas, the charge of mounted police, the prison. And the A.F. of L and old guard socialist trade union leaders condoned all these attacks upon the T.U.U.L. and other militant forces by the combined bosses, police, gangsters, etc. In this T.U.U.L. baptism of fire, hundreds of workers were beaten up, jailed, deported. Many also were killed. The Labor Research Association listed 23 workers killed in T.U.U.L. struggles from September 1929 to March 1933. Among these were 8 killed in strikes, including Ella Mae Wiggin in Gastonia, Steve Katovis in New York, Harry Sims, Y.C.L. and N.M.U. organizer, in Kentucky, etc. There were 15 killed in unemployment demonstrations, including 5 in the famous Hunger March on the Detroit Ford plant March 7, 1932, 3 Negro workers shot down in a Chicago anti-eviction fight on August 4, 1931, etc. At a local T.U.U.L. conference in New York in 1931, the Food Workers' Industrial Union displayed no injunctions issued against its New York strikes. The struggle of the unemployed. During the period of the crisis with which this chapter concerns itself, up until the beginning of Roosevelt's term, the T.U.U.L. devoted its major activities to organizing and leading the starving multitudes of unemployed. Its organization was the National Unemployment Council, at first headed by H. Benjamin and later by I. Amateur and A. Mills. Originally this organization was directly affiliated to the T.U.U.L., but later it operated as an independent body, with the full support of the C.P.T.U.U.L.Y.C.L. and other revolutionary bodies. The T.U.U.L. made the central issue in this work the demand for federal unemployment insurance at the expense of the government and the employers, and on the basis of the average wages of employed workers. Its demands were in line with the T.U.U.L. Convention Resolution on Social Insurance, and it crystallized them eventually in legislative form in the Workers' Unemployment Insurance Bill, H.R. 2827. The T.U.U.L. also fought for every form of unemployment relief, including local cash relief, public works at union wages, against evictions, for free food for school children, etc. It organized the workers into block, neighborhood, city and national committees and councils, on a non-dues-paying basis. Its major method of struggle was the mass demonstration, but it also carried on intense work for relief of individual cases. It ruthlessly exposed all the many false charity schemes of the period, miserable substitutes for effective insurance and relief. Central in its strategy was the linking up of the struggles of the unemployed with those of the employed. A very important feature of the T.U.U.L. unemployed work was its support of the left-wing A.F.L. Committee for Unemployment Insurance and Relief, headed by Louis Weinstock. This rank-and-file body carried on a wide agitation in the trade unions for unemployment insurance and relief and against the reactionary green policies of Stagger Plan, local charity relief, expulsion of unemployed from the unions for non-payment of dues, etc. At a government hearing in Washington, February 1934, Weinstock testified that more than 3,000 A.F.L. unions had endorsed the Workers' Bill, H.R. 2827, and many hundreds more have done so since. The work of this committee was largely responsible for forcing the A.F.L., at its 1932 convention, to reverse its reactionary attitude and to give at least lip service to unemployment insurance. The National Unemployment Council, jointly with the C.P. and T.U.U.L., was the first to take up the fight for the unemployed, the A.F.L. openly supporting Hoover and the S.P. toying about with every capitalist fake charity scheme. Thus Norman Thomas joined over the radio with J.P. Morgan in support of the delusive blockade system, and only beginning to organize the unemployed 2 years after our forces had blazed the way. Consequently, great masses of workers rallied to the leadership of the Unemployment Council movement. Under the slogans, "Don't Starve," "Fight," and "Work or Wages," it conducted many militant national demonstration struggles. The first of these was the famous one of March 6, 1930, which brought some 1,250,000 workers into the streets, including 110,000 in New York, 100,000 in Detroit, etc. This demonstration definitely raised the issue of unemployment insurance to the level of a living national, political question. In New York, with huge masses of unemployed and with the bourgeoisie in a panic of fear, the situation became very tense just prior to March 6. A few days before this date, Matthew Wall, openly cooperating with the police, limely announced far and wide through the press that the T.U.U.L. had received $2 million from Moscow to stage the demonstration. Police Commissioner Whalen forbade the proposed march to City Hall and mobilized the 18,000 police and 7,000 firemen of Greater New York to prevent it. Union Square was saturated with police and the nearby buildings bristled with machine guns. We attempted to march nevertheless, whereupon the police charged upon the forming procession and clubbed it to purses, injuring many workers. The Workers' Committee, including Bob Miner, I, Amateur, Harry Raymond and myself, were arrested and sentenced to 3 years in the New York County Penitentiary, of which sentence we served 6 months apiece, except Raymond who did 10 months. The rest we did on parole. Besides this fight, the U.C. with the full support of the C, P, T, U, U, L, Y, C, L, etc., carried through many other national unemployed demonstrations, hunger marches, mass delegations, conventions, etc. 3 times there were national petitions of 1 million or more signatures presented to Congress. Some of the more important of these big movements were the National Unemployed Convention in Chicago, July 4, 1930, with 1,500 delegates, national unemployment. Insurance Day, February 25, 1931, with 400,000 demonstrators, and February 4, 1932, with 500,000 demonstrators. The National Hunger March of December 7, 1931, with 1,800 delegates to Washington, the Second National Hunger March of December 6, 1932, with 3,000 delegates and an estimated 1 million participants in various cities, the big national demonstration upon Roosevelt's Inauguration Day. March 4, 1933. The T. U. U. L. also actively supported the famous Veterans Bonus March to Washington in 1932, which was driven out of the Capitol by Hoover at the point of the bayonet. The call for this march was issued by the Revolutionary Workers' Ex-Servicemen's League, headed by E. Levin, although the movement took on such a swift mass character that it largely escaped W. E. S. L. control, but the main field of T. U. U. L. unemployment struggle was in the various localities. Here the U. C. conducted numberless city and state hunger marches, anti-eviction fights, unemployed conventions, etc. Nearly every industrial center saw such activities. The demonstrations were extremely militant, usually facing violent attacks from the police. Altogether, they were a powerful force in compelling the reluctant city authorities to grant relief to the starving masses. To take only a couple from many such examples, during the fall of 1932, the City Council of St. Louis decided to cut 17,000 families off the relief rolls, but the unemployed council, by a vast and militant demonstration, forced the immediate abandonment of this barbarous proposal, and in Chicago in the summer of 1932, the Unemployment Council in a united front with the Unemployed Citizens League, by great mass movements, defeated a projected 50% cut in relief. Similar results were achieved in dozens of other cities by the policy of militant mass struggle. In developing this great fight of the unemployed, the C. P. T. U. U. L. and U. C. wrote some of the finest pages of struggle in American labor history. The movement was a definite force in saving the masses from actual starvation and eventually compelling federal relief measures on a large scale. It was in brilliant contrast to the deeply reactionary policy of the A. F. of L and the vacillating, dabbling attitude of the S. P. the T. U. U. L. in the mining industry. After its reorganization at Cleveland, the T. U. U. L. broadened out its strike activities. The continued decline and decay of the A. F. of L in the early crisis years broadened the base for independent unionism in the industries generally throughout the country, and it threw ever greater burdens of leadership upon the revolutionary unions. But the T. U. U. L's greatest field of struggle still remained the mining industry. Here the T. U. U. L. conducted several big movements in the crisis period up to the Roosevelt regime. The most important of these was the National Miners' Union strike during the summer of 1931 in western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio and northern West Virginia. Embracing 42,000 miners, it was the largest strike ever led by a revolutionary union in the United States. Following the loss of the 1927-28 strike and the breakup of the U. M. W. A. in these districts, wages had dropped from $7.50 to as low as $2 per day. Working conditions were ruined, huge unemployment prevailed, and actual starvation stalked the whole mining region. Into this situation came the newly organized N. M. U. led by such fighters as its secretary, Frank Borch, Pat Toohey, T. Myerscough, Leo Thompson, Dan Slinger, Tony Manurek, V. Kamenovich, etc. After a wide agitation and a few successful local mine strikes, which roused hope among the defeated and demoralized miners, the N. M. U. calling for a strike against starvation, declared war against the new wave of wage cuts. The strike began on May 27, 1931, in the Atlasburg McDonald mines, where 1,000 walked out. Swiftly it spread. A strike fever seized upon the bitterly oppressed miners all around. By June 1, 16,000 were out, and by the latter part of June it reached 42,000, of whom about 6,000 were Negroes. The strike involved the mines of many of the greatest trusts in America. The C. P. and T. U. U. L. sent in a number of organizers, including Bill Dunn, Jack Johnston, A. Wagenknecht, myself, etc., to help the small and weak N.M.U. But still there was a desperate shortage of organizers to unite and strike the willing miners. Had we promptly assembled greater forces, undoubtedly we could have pulled out at least 100,000 miners and possibly have won the strike. The strike shook the whole district, the steel workers began to stir, and the unemployed staged huge demonstrations. A great upheaval was in the making in the affected territory. The workers' fighting spirit was wonderful, and 25,000 of them joined the N.M.U. Men, women and children poured out onto the mass picket lines. United Front local and general strike committees were set up, the first time in the United States that this method of organization had been applied on a large scale. The government, operators and A.F.L. leaders fought the strike desperately. The striking miners faced an army of state police, deputy sheriffs and coal and iron police. Department of Labor agents combed the district to deport foreign-born militants. The courts issued one sweeping injunction after another. The armed forces jailed, beat up and shot innumerable strikers, 2 being killed, and the companies evicted 100,000 men, women and children, and flooded the district with strikebreakers, driven into the mines by hunger. But the worst blow to the strike came when the U.M.W.A. signed a local agreement at the Pittsburgh Terminal Coal Company mines, accepting the wage cut. The operators and the government, from Hoover down, joined in a common cry of, "Rebuild the U.M.W.A. as a bulwark against the revolutionary N.M.U. Between the U.M.W.A. and the N.M.U. forces it came to open struggles, and Myerscough, Thompson and several other militants did 2 years in jail for such a fight. On July 15, in Pittsburgh, the N.M.U. held a National United Front Conference of Miners to spread the strike. Present were 685 delegates from 270 mines in 8 states. The conference decided to try to extend the struggle into other districts. But before this could be done, the strike, confronting many terrific difficulties, began to weaken, and the men dribbled back to work. On August 18, the General Aerial Strike Committee in Pittsburgh, somewhat belatedly, practically called off the strike by deciding that the workers at each mine should secure the best terms possible. The strike was lost and the N.M.U. received a deadly blow. Many miners were blacklisted, but at least a check was put to the terrific deterioration of the miners' conditions. When the rebuilding of the U.M.W.A. took place under Roosevelt's New Deal, winning recognition for it was made the easier by the boss's vivid memories of the great N.M.U. 1931 strike. An important aftermath of this great strike was a walkout of the Kentucky miners soon afterward, led by the N.M.U. These miners, formerly under U.M.W.A. leadership, had been carrying on for many months one of the most desperate strikes in the history of the American coal industry. The fight became almost a guerrilla war, many being killed on both sides. Disgusted by U.M.W.A. misleadership and inspired by the N.M.U.'s heroic fight, a delegation of Kentucky miners, led by Dan Slinger, came to the N.M.U. National Strike Conference in Pittsburgh, joined the organization and went back to re-strike Kentucky and Tennessee. They met a fierce onslaught of propaganda and terrorism by the operators and their hangers-on, who shrieked against the menace of communism. The Kentucky fields became almost an armed camp, and the whole local N.M.U. leadership was arrested in Pineville. On January 1931, over 8,000 miners, nearly all American-born for generations past, struck. But this strike lacked force, as it was ill-prepared in face of the fierce terrorism prevailing, and it soon frittered away. The N.M.U. also conducted much activity in the Illinois district. Immediately after its formation in 1929, it succeeded, under the leadership of H. Corbishley, Freeman, Thompson, G. Voisey, and others, in organizing into the N.M.U. several thousand miners in the southern coal counties, who were in revolt against the corrupt Illinois U.M.W.A. leaders. Then, but without sufficient preparation, a strike was called against the worsening conditions in the mines and the oppressively used checkoff system of the U.M.W.A. An estimated 10,000 to 15,000 men struck for a few days, but ineffectually. This ill-advised, poorly organized strike killed the N.M.U. in Illinois and greatly undermined the years-long strong C.P. and T.U.U.L. influence in these coalfields. After this defeat, the N.M.U. forces in Illinois gradually liquidated its skeleton locals and supported the growing opposition movement in the U.M.W.A. This latter movement, led principally by socialists and Mustyites, and one of the many similar movements developing all through the coal industry, is the U.M.W. A. declined in strength and fighting spirit, finally split from the U.M.W.A. in the fall of 1932 and formed the Progressive Miners of America. Between the P.M.A. and the U.M.W.A., there later raged a bitter struggle for local control that has cost 23 lives in the many armed clashes in Illinois. The P.M.A. afterwards developed a very reactionary leadership and policy. In the anthracite districts of eastern Pennsylvania, the N.M.U. at first tried to build local unions, but soon seeing the unwisdom of this in these organized districts, began to function as the left-wing opposition in the U.M.W.A. Conditions were very bad in the mines and the leadership was servile to the mine operators, hence several powerful opposition movements developed, usually culminating in outlaw strikes and eventually producing a dual miners' union. The T.U.U.L. gained much influence in these movements, but was never able to win the leadership from the Morgans, Schusters and others who juggled them about. In the textile industry, the National Textile Workers Union, with Jim Reed as president, was born out of the New Bedford, 1928, strike of 25,000 textile workers, where the old T.U.E.L. had played a decisive role in partially defeating a 10% general wage cut. After this strike, the N.T.W.U. sent organizers into the South and soon secured a foothold in the Gastonia, North Carolina, mills. The local workers, totally unorganized, were acutely discontented at the extremely low wages and the murderous stretch out or speed up system. The district was full of child labor, poverty and the terrible hunger disease, pellagra. On March 12, 1929, some 6,000 unorganized rayon workers struck spontaneously at Elizabethton, Tennessee. The N.T.W.U., immersed in the developing struggle at Gastonia, failed to get its organizers to Elizabethton in time, so the strike passed into the hands of the A.F.R.L., who proceeded to quickly slough it off. On April 2, the N.T.W.U. exhibited sharply a characteristic weakness of T.U.U.L. unions, fluctuations in the leadership. In its 5 years of life it had a number of national secretaries: Keller, Weisbord, Miller, Murdoch, Devine, Russick, Burlack. Organized Gastonia workers struck in the Manville-Jenkins mills under the leadership of the N.T.W.U. The strike spread quickly and finally involved about 5,000 workers in the Gastonia area. From the outset the bosses made desperate efforts to break the very militant strike. Gastonia was the spark that started a burning fever of strike revolts far and wide among the vast masses of southern textile workers against the intolerable stretch-out and low-wage system. Strikes broke out rapidly in Marion, Greenville, Danville and many other places. Seldom or never has American industry experienced such a tremendous spontaneous upheaval of unorganized workers. But the T.U.U.L. lost a great opportunity to take the lead of the whole struggle. Thanks to its Gastonia prestige and by throwing in all possible field organizers and calling a general Southern Textile Conference, it could have united the many scattered fights into one great coordinated struggle. But the Lovestone Group, then leading the C.P., had little mass organizing experience and scoffed at this proposal to spread the struggle and, instead, concentrated all efforts upon Gastonia. The general effect was to isolate fatally the N.T.W.U. in terror-ridden Gastonia and to let the leadership of the general spontaneous movement go to the A.F.L. by default. For suddenly the A.F.L., greatly alarmed at the danger of red unionism in textiles, decided to organize the Southern mill workers. Thereupon, William Greene sent in a lot of organizers and got control of the main strike situation throughout the South. The A.F.L. proceeded, with the prevailing no-strike policy, to stifle all militant action and to slough off all strikes on the basis of B&O. Plan speed-up agreements with the bosses. The tragedy was that the workers were fighting against the speed-up, whereas encouraging the hated speed-up was the very heart of A.F.L. policy. Everywhere, the workers fought bravely against the gangsters, troops and police, many being killed. But they had no chance to win. The trickery of the A.F.L. and of the Must group of progressives proved too much for them. Their strikes were everywhere beaten and the whole great movement collapsed in ruins. It all made another tragic monument to A.F.L. misleadership. Meanwhile, a fierce struggle was proceeding at Gastonia. The N.T.W.U. strikers were extremely militant, and the boss's thugs viciously brutal. It was here that L.M.A. Wiggin was shot down in cold blood by a gunman. In one of many terroristic attempts to break the strikers' solidarity, the police and company guards made an armed raid on the strikers' camp of the Workers' International Relief. The workers defended themselves guns in hand. After a sharp fight, the raiders were beaten back, Chief of Police Adderhold being killed. Infuriated, the bosses organized a wave of lynch spirit, in which 70 workers were arrested and charged with murder. Eventually, 15 of them, including L. McLaughlin, W. M. McGinnis, K. Y. Hendricks, Clarence, Miller, F. Beale, who later turned traitor, Russell Knight, etc., were sentenced to from 5 to 17-year penitentiary terms. The strike was finally broken. During most of this struggle the T.U.L. forces in Gastonia were led by Bill Dunn. In the course of the next 2 years the N.T.W.U. participated in many local strike struggles in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire and Connecticut, involving some 50,000 workers. These were nearly all either wholly or partially successful in defeating wage cuts and checking the speed-up system. In 1931, the N.T.W.U., simultaneously with the U.T.W. and Associated Silk Workers, called a strike in Paterson. The N.T.W.U. did most of the fighting, but the other unions, aided by bosses, newspapers, etc., got the compromise settlements. Anything to defeat the Red Unions was the employer A.F. of L slogan in the textile industry as well as in others. In February 1931, also, the N.T.W.U., led locally by Edith Berkman, won a strike of 10,000 workers in Lawrence against the speed-up, preventing a big layoff and forcing the discharge of the FEC&C engineers. This important victory raised high the workers' spirits, so that, in October 1931, 23,500 of them, mostly unorganized, struck the biggest local walkout since the famous I.W. Lawrence strike of 1912. In the meantime, the N.T.W.U. leader, Edith Berkman, had been arrested by the Department of Labor and held for deportation. This fact, coupled with suppression of free assembly for the N.T.W.U., enabled the A.F. of L to secure control of the strike, which was soon lost completely. In the above and many other militantly fought strikes the N.T.W.U. built its prestige far and wide in the textile industry. With the A.F. of L Union reduced to a skeleton, and to powerlessness by no strike, speed-up policies, the workers had no defenders but the N.T.W.U. But the latter's membership remained small, fluctuating between 5,000 and 10,000. It was hated and feared and its members were blacklisted by the bosses. The A.F. of L Textile Union, U.T.W. leaders stuck at nothing in order to defeat its strikes, and almost everywhere the N.T.W.U. encountered the opposition of the Socialist Party and the must confer ends for progressive labor action. In the needle trades, we have seen already that although the A.F. of L leaders talked very much during the first 3 years of the crisis about the necessity of maintaining wage rates, they nevertheless materially helped employers to cut them. First by accepting the hypocritical Hoover no wage cut, no strike agreement, which facilitated the bosses slashing wages in the unorganized industries, and then, when this had been accomplished, by the unions themselves, voluntarily, accepting wage reductions. The needle trades socialist union leaders followed this same general line, even as they had pursued the A.F. In this period of intense struggle the Department of Labor openly joined with the bosses and attacked the N.T.W.U. as well as other T.U.L. unions. It seized William Murdoch and Pat Devine, successive N.T.W.U. national secretaries, and deported them. It also arrested and tried to deport the succeeding secretary, Anne Burlack, an American-born girl. Of L 1923-29 policy of speed-up and intensified class collaboration. True, during these early crisis years there were a number of large strikes in the needle trades. These strikes were amicably conducted in full agreement with the employers and amidst the applause of the capitalist press. They usually lasted only a few days, and they all ended with widely advertised victories for the workers. The only practical results of these strikes, however, were to reduce wages and speed up the workers, to bring the unorganized workers into the reformist unions, and to compel scattering small employers to join the bosses' associations. During the years 1929-32, a score or more of such successful strikes took place, covering the bulk of the needleworkers in every important garment center, yet the needleworkers' wages and working conditions tumbled precipitously. The newly organized Needle Trades Workers Industrial Union, located in New York, with L. Hyman, president, and B. Gold, secretary, undertook a gallant struggle against the downward trend of the needleworkers' standards. It bitterly resisted the current A.F. of L wage cuts and piecework policies. With the slogan of, "Transform the fake strikes into real strikes," it followed the policy of calling out its own forces in the affected shops of such strikes and urging the A.F. of L and A.C.W. workers, on a united front basis, to cooperate with the N.T.W.I.U. in developing a militant struggle for real demands. Thus, the N.T.W.I.U. was able to greatly strengthen the A.F. of L needleworkers' resistance and to at least partly shield them from the engulfing wave of wage cuts and general worsening of conditions. Besides this participation in A.F. of L strikes, the N.T.W.I.U. conducted many struggles under its own banner. These were far too numerous to detail here. A few of the more important of its strikes during the Hoover years of the crisis were 10,000 New York dressmakers, February 1929, 2,000 New York furriers, June 1929, 3,000 New York dressmakers, February 1931, 4,000 New York furriers, July 1931, 8,000 New York dressmakers, February 1932, 7,000 New York furriers, July 1932, 1,800 South River dressmakers. August 1932. There were also many N.T.W.I.U. strikes in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, etc. The Labor Research Association estimated that during these years there were also out in single New York shop strikes, some 30,000 workers under N.T.W.I.U. leadership. Many of these strikes resulted in partial victories. The struggle of the N.T.W.I.U. was an especially difficult one, faced as the organization was by bosses, gangsters, police, courts, newspapers and A.F. of L and Socialist Party leaders. Nevertheless, the T.U.U.L. Union succeeded in entrenching itself in the industry, especially in the fur section, where it far outstripped the A.F. of L Union in numbers and influence. It enjoyed wide prestige among the needleworkers generally, its militant fighting spirit greatly stiffening their resistance. It was a real barrier to the wage-cutting bosses. Always to them the fear of the fighting N.T.W.I.U. getting control of the workers was a powerful deterrent. But the N.T.W.I.U. never succeeded in building itself into a large union. All through its existence its membership fluctuated between a minimum of about 15,000 and a maximum of some 30,000. Asterisk, for a detailed account of N.T.W.I.U. history, read Jack Hardy's The Clothing Workers, International Publishers. Automobile, steel, marine. The automobile industry, with its high development of specialization, mechanization, rationalization and trustification, presents a classical example of the failure of the A.F. of L craft unionists to organize the mass production industries. It long offered an open invitation to independent unionism. During the war period the Automobile, Aircraft and Vehicle Workers Union, an independent union, displayed some activity, but it was smashed in the post-war employers' offensive. The Detroit, 1926, Vention boasted loudly that it would organize the automobile workers, but when the automobile kings rejected the A.F. of L's proposals to help them speed up the workers, they were satisfied with their own speed-up systems. The 19 unions claiming jurisdiction gave up their organizing campaign without further effort. Shortly afterward T.U.E.L. forces won the leadership of the isolated Detroit local of the old A.and.V.W.U. In 1929 this was expanded into the Auto Workers Union, T.U.U.L. The A.W.U. located in Detroit and led by Phil Raymond, John Schmies, W. Getz, etc., carried on an active campaign among the automobile workers and took an important part in the many big unemployed struggles of the C.P. and unemployed councils in Detroit. Its first important strike was in the Fisher Body Plant in Flint, July 1931, 5,000 workers being involved. This strike was lost through its plant leadership falling into the hands of company tools. The union also conducted a number of smaller strikes. The most important strikes led by the Auto Workers Union in the pre-Roosevelt crisis period, the time with which this chapter deals, took place in January to February 1933. The bosses were carrying on a heavy wage cut offensive. The A.W.U. developed a strike of 600 at the Briggs Waterloo plant and defeated the cut. This victory was a spark that touched things off. Soon followed a series of strikes, all victorious, that culminated in die strike of 10,000 workers of the Briggs plants, which furnish auto bodies for Ford. This strike, which won a few concessions but was finally lost, brought the great Ford plant to a standstill for several days, the first time it had ever been halted by strike action. Another partial strike of 3,000 at the Hudson Motors plant was partially successful. These strikes, which substantially increased the membership and prestige of the A.W.U., played a great role as starters for the big strike wave that took place under the N.R.A. The A.W.U. reached a maximum of 5,000 members in 1933. The Steel and Metalworkers Industrial Union, SEC. Retirees J. Meldon, J. Powers and J. Egan, was formed in Pittsburgh in August 1932 by a reorganization of the old T.U.E.L. Metalworkers Industrial League, formerly headed by A. Overgaard. The S&M.W.I.U. came into existence because of the weakness, corruption, decrepitude and general reactionary spirit of the A.F.L. Union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel and Tin Workers, A union which made no effort whatever to organize steel workers. During the crisis period we are here considering, up to Roosevelt's inauguration, the S&M.W.I.U. occupied itself principally with mass agitation and work among the unemployed. Its principal strike was one of 1,500 workers at the Warren, Ohio, plant of the Republic Steel Corp. September 1, 1932, which ended successfully. In March 1933, the union contained only 1,400 dues-paying members, but it had succeeded in gaining a wide influence which was soon to translate itself into very important strikes under the N.R.A. The Marine Transport Workers Industrial Union, Secretary Roy Hudson, was organized in New York in March 1933, with a membership of about 2,000. It was a reorganization of the old Marine Workers Industrial League, of which George Mink was secretary, and it grew out of the state of demoralization in the industry created by the dozen weak and squabbling A.F.L. craft unions, of which the most important are the International Longshoremen's Association and the International Seamen's Union, headed respectively by the ultra-reactionary Ryan and Faruseth Allender cliques. The league that preceded the M.T.W.I.U. had carried on much agitation and conducted a number of small strikes among sailors, longshoremen and riverboatmen in Philadelphia, Galveston, New Orleans, Duluth, Sacramento, etc. This work culminated in the formation of the M.T.W.I.U., which, under the New Deal, was to lead the first important marine transport strikes for 10 years and to play a very important part in the Great San Francisco General Strike. At the Cleveland Convention of the T.U.U.L., there was organized the Agricultural Workers Industrial League by a handful of agricultural worker delegates from the far west. Later the league was reorganized into the Cannery and Agricultural Workers Industrial Union. This organization, so inauspiciously launched, was soon to lead the biggest agricultural workers' strikes on record in this country and to become the most successful union that farm workers have so far produced in the United States. The A.F.L., of course, had completely neglected the agricultural workers and the field was wide open for a T.U.U.L. union. The C&A.W.I.U., at that time still a league, a worthy heir to the best fighting traditions of the I.W.W. agricultural unions, led 2 militant strikes in Imperial Valley, California, in 1930, one of 2,500 workers and the other of 4,000. The strikers were mostly Mexicans, Filipinos and Japanese. The strikes were carried on under acute terror conditions, but nevertheless resulted in substantial gains for the workers. As a result of a mass raid on the union headquarters, 100 workers were arrested and 8 of their leaders, F. Spector, K. Sklar, O. Erickson, L. Emery, D. Roxas, B. Orozco, T. Horiuchi and E. Herrera, were eventually sent to San Quentin Penitentiary for terms of from 3 to 42 years each. Another very important struggle of Tire C and A.W.I.U. was the strike of 18,000 Colorado beet workers in the spring of 1932. Again violent measures were used against the strikers, thousands of the Mexican workers being deported. Some concessions were secured. This strike was led by Pat Toohey and C. Ginn, under the auspices of the United Front Committee of Action of Beet Workers, a grouping that included several fraternal organizations. The main stronghold of the C&A.W.I.U. was in California and the Southwest, although it had some locals in other states, including as far east as New Jersey. In April 1933, it led at San Jose 2,200 pea pickers on strike. In June 1933, over 2,000 cotton choppers struck under its leadership in eastern New Mexico. In September 1933, about 6,000 California grape pickers and several thousand lettuce workers. In October 1933, some 18,000 cotton pickers in Southern California and Arizona, etc. In the next chapter we shall see how the Union's leadership was jailed for these militant and successful strikes. The C and A, W, I, U County operated with organizations of poor farmers, such as the Sharecroppers Union and the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, and directed its main struggles against the powerful farming concerns. The Food Workers Industrial Union, headed, among others, by M. Obermeyer, S. Bloomfield and J. Rubin, grew out of a split-off from the Amalgamated Food Workers in 1930. Its headquarters and strongest organizations were in New York. This union had behind it a T. U. E. L. tradition of a dozen years of left-wing agitation in the A. F. W. The A. F. of L unions and among the unorganized. The Food Workers Industrial Union led hundreds of small strikes in New York restaurants, cafeterias and food stores. It especially had to fight the injunction menace. No sooner would the union strike a place than it would confront a ready Athens injunction, secured jointly by the bosses and A. F. of L. leaders. In following out the T. U. L. policy of mass violation of these injunctions, hundreds of its members were jailed. Although many of the F. W. I. U strikes were successful, it had succeeded in building a stable membership of only 1,500 members by March 1933, which is as far as this chapter takes us, although the Union shortly after that date increased its membership several times over. The Shoe and Leather Workers Industrial Union, led by F. Biedenkap, S. Zeebel, etc., was organized in September 1931, and maintained its headquarters in New York. Its predecessor was the Independent Shoe Workers Union, an organization chiefly of Brooklyn shoe workers, and before that the old T. U. E. L. Tion Committee. These organizations conducted many strikes under their own banners, as well as struggles within the several independent shoe workers organizations and the reactionary A. F. of L. Boot and Shoe Workers Union. The most important of their strikes were the I. S. W. U. New York, 1929, strike of 4,500 workers, which was successful, and the S. and L. W. I. U strike of 1,400 workers in 1932, which was lost. Other T. U. L. unions and groups. The Tobacco Workers Industrial Union was organized in April 1931. Its headquarters were in New York, and its principal national leaders L. Terrace, P. Uffrey and A. Ramirez. This union, mostly local in character, had as a forerunner the important strike of 7,000 T. U. L. cigar makers in Tampa, Florida, in November 1930. In that city the authority ties, because the union celebrated the Russian Revolution on November 7, arrested 15 leading members. The union replied to this by a 3-day general strike which tied up every cigar factory in Tampa. Through a reign of terror the union was finally broken and H. Bonilla, C. Lezama and J. E. McDonald were sentenced to 10 years and C. Alvarez and F. Marrero to 3 years each on the infamous Florida chain gang. The T. W. I. U also conducted big New York shop strikes in 1931 and a general strike in the same city in August 1932, altogether involving 5,000 workers. In these struggles, however, the union built up only a small membership. The Lumber Workers Industrial Union, Roy Brown, Secretary, headquarters in Seattle, was organized in 1931, out of the fragments of the old A. F. of L and I. W. Organizations of lumber workers. It conducted a number of small strikes in the Pacific Northwest, but at the time of the beginning of the New Deal counted only a membership of some 3,000. The Furniture Workers Industrial Union, Joe Kiss, Secretary, was organized in New York, February 9, 1934. It was in existence about 14 months when it was amalgamated with the A. F. of L. Upholstery Workers. The union conducted an important general strike under the New Deal. The Food and Packing House Workers Industrial Union. Sam Weissman, Secretary, headquarters New York. It conducted a few strikes and built up a small membership. Besides the foregoing 13 national industrial unions, the T. U. L. contained a number of local organizations, including, among others, the Building Maintenance Workers Union, Fishermen and Cannery Workers Industrial Union, Barbers Industrial Union, Novelty Leather Workers Union, Jewelry Workers Industrial Union, Office Workers Union, Wholesale and Dry Goods Workers Union, Printing Workers Industrial Union, Taxi Workers Union, Doll and Toy Makers Industrial Union, Photographic Workers Industrial Union, Laundry Workers Industrial Union, etc. The most important trade union Unity Council, or local central body, of the T. U. L was in New York. It reached a membership of 45,000 by the end of 1933, and during the last quarter of 1933 led strikes of 65,000 workers. Its secretaries during its 5 years of existence were Jack Johnston, Joseph Sack, J. Steuben, A. Overgaard. The T.U.U.L. also contained many left-wing groups in the A.F. of L unions and railroad brotherhoods. Such were to be found principally in the mining, needle, building, shoe, metal, printing, and other industries where the craft unions had a grip. They all played a considerable role in the life and struggles of their organizations during the T.U.U.L. period. These groups were all local in scope except the Railroad Workers Industrial League, O. Wangerin, Secretary, Headquarters Chicago, and the Printing Trades Industrial League of New York.